What's up, guys? Alexander here with Date Psychology. I'm here with William Costello. If you'd like to introduce yourself, tell us about yourself.
William Costello of the David Buss Lab. Oh! My favourite lab, the David Buss Lab. So, William Costello, I'm vaguely aware. Well, I came across him in my research because he appeared on the Chris William podcast, my favourite podcast, the Chris Williamson podcast, talking about incels. And I was quite surprised to see William Costello appear on the Novara Media podcast. I was surprised to see him on Novara because I viewed him as a rather pro-incel guy. Essentially, what he tries to do is explain why incels exist through narratives of evolutionary psychology. Essentially, he tries to say it's inevitable that incels will exist because Vikings. I feel like that's like a very reductive way of explaining what he tends to say on podcasts, but that's like the most sort of condensed version I can give. Incels exist because Vikings.
Many people know you already, but...
Yeah, I'm happy to appear for the first time on Alex's channel, Date Psychology. I'm a big fan for a number of years now. And we're actually here coming to you from my family home in Ireland, where Alex happened to be visiting on a vacation. And we're the type of nerdy guys that when we're on vacation, we like to make science videos. So happy to bring this to you from my family home.
I'm very happy to be here in the castle. This castle, William's family castle here in the country. It's beautiful. And let's see, we have our little...
Is it actually his family's castle? Is that really? Your family has a castle?
We'll set up, if the sound is a little bit worse than it usually is, well, that's what we have. Would you say this has been adapted to its environment?
You're in a fucking castle?
This microphone.
It's going to be a little bit echoey in a castle, yeah.
Evolution is ongoing. We are not stuck in the Pleistocene. It always adapts to its environment. So that's an example of our innovation niche. We're adapting to any type of niche in nature, even this room.
Always adapting. So a video was made recently, very high production quality by someone whose name is...
Oh, thank you so much. Oh.
Mooncat debunks evolutionary psychology.
Yeah, by the way, this is from 7 months ago, and I never got round to really watching it.
So this is the response video to that. I'll go on, I'll show you guys here. This is the video, and going forward, let's see what we're kind of looking at here. So this is a 3.5 hour video. A lot of entertainment value.
Yeah, sorry about that. A lot of entertainment value. Oh, that's nice. That's nice. Wait, can we have a chair? Yeah, that's a nice thing.
Even that, I suppose. A lot of music, a lot of songs and singing and entertainment, but that's a large portion of the video, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, and we can't promise to do too much singing or costume changes or maybe interrogate.
I want songs.
Some of the science that was presented. And yeah, this video came on my radar because I recently did an interview for a large left-wing platform called Novara Media.
Yeah, this is what I was talking about. He went on Novara Media.
Yeah, with Ash.
And I was surprised. He had a conversation with Ash Sarkar. I've not watched the whole thing. I've watched bits of it, to be honest. I've not watched the whole thing.
Sarkar. And it was one of my first times kind of reaching across the aisle to a far-left kind of channel. And it went really well. She was actually very fair in talking about the evolutionary psychology, about my incel research, and it was a very positive experience. But in the comments on the YouTube video, I noticed a lot of people kept linking to this Mooncat video, saying, oh, wow, don't you know evolutionary psychology has been debunked by Mooncat? So I was kind of nervous, thinking, oh, I got to check out this video, thinking, oh my God, I'm worried. Maybe we have been debunked. But when I actually sat through the 3.5 hours, which we did so you don't have to kind of thing, although we'd encourage you to after watching our video. Yeah, I wasn't impressed. I was kind of a little bit disappointed. It was kind of very juvenile, very ad hominem in style, attacking certain people, guilty of what I would describe as kind of
fun is not allowed, fun is not allowed.
Nut picking, using very...
Nut picking? Did he say nut? I thought it was nitpicking. Apparently we're picking people's nuts now instead of nits.
Kind of extreme examples depicted in a very extreme way as representative of evolutionary psychology. And just more than anything with the science, it was kind of so loose and fast with the science that it approached the point of lying for me at certain points. And we'll go through
All right, let's get into it then, baby.
some of that today. But yeah, and at other times it just had fundamental misunderstandings that are quite pervasive about evolutionary psychology that hopefully we can kind of dispel a little bit today or give a different perspective. But basically the kind of feeling I was left with after it was, for a long time I had this kind of negative feeling that evolutionary psychology was up against an attack from the extreme right wing of like creationists in America in particular who deny evolution at all. And a kind of a counterpoint to that, I always used to think that the extreme left were evolutionary psychology deniers, or thinking that evolution only applied from the neck down, or just thinking that evolution applied to us up until a certain point and no longer does to modern humans. And I always thought, oh, maybe I'm being a bit uncharitable there, maybe I'm being a bit unfair. But after watching this video, it really was approaching creationist level thinking, of thinking that humans, just evolutionary psychology, that our mind doesn't appear to work, as looking at the mind through an evolutionary psychology lens was kind of lampooned in this video.
I'd love for him to explain how I ended up at creationism.
So that was very strange. So I'm kind of left thinking, clowns to the left of me, jokers to the right, but happy to be in the middle with you, Alex.
Yeah, I agree. That's certainly my impression as well. I think a lot of people associate evolutionary psychology now with kind of these manosphere figures. We'll talk about that a little bit, but certainly they get it wrong at a lot of levels. A lot of what I've written has been on that, kind of how the manosphere gets evolutionary psychology wrong. But my impressions of this video, so she talks about, a good point I think she made was kind of that emotions are crucial in forming beliefs. And this video actually plays on that a lot, right? We're rarely purely logical beings. So, we use emotions in decision making. We use vibes, kind of this heuristic decision making that Gerd Gerzinger would have talked about, for example.
Yes.
But it's a really good way to make people believe something if you just repeat something over and over, which is kind of what she did. Kind of this mockery of it over and over, this repetition. It's bad. It's so bad. People that are unfamiliar with it might just believe that because someone has repeated it enough. Similar with like ridicule and making fun of something. If you make fun of something consistently enough, that's a great way to signal, here's the in-group affiliation, there is the out-group, they're ridiculous, and not making any...
It's true, but that also the manosphere and people like William Costello, they also appeal to authority a hell of a lot. They don't use appeal to ridicule a lot, but they used a hell of a lot of appeal to authority. That's what they mostly use.
Substantive arguments in that sense. Certainly she really went out of her way to make fun of Jeffrey Miller, didn't she? What do you think of that?
Yeah, it got kind of weirdly personal at times, even dredging up photographs from Jeffrey's marriage, which seemed a bit kind of close to the bone and low from my perspective. And I thought I
was just given a little bit of a background on him as a character. I wasn't really I was saying it, to be honest, I was saying it was kind of sweet when he married another. I was saying it was kind of sweet that he married another evolutionary psychologist and they used the peacock feathers in their wedding. All I said about that was, oh, that was all I said. But I get maybe in the context, I guess maybe you'd think that I was that came from a really sort of, I don't know, mean part of it. Didn't really. I was just kind of oh, that's cute.
Left wing was...
Doesn't mean I agree with anything you say.
Supposed to be kind of like a kinder, gentler politics type of style, but that seemed anything but. And kind of a little bit of misrepresentation of him and his marriage and their open relationship and their attitude to polyamory. And that was lampooned along with a lot of other...
What? I did not lampoon polyamory even in the fucking slightest. What I did lampoon was their reason for polyamory. That's what I lampooned, because their reason for polyamory is basically Jeffrey Miller has high quality sperm, so he should be able to have sex with as many women as possible. That's what I was lampooning.
Things, but there's plenty maybe fairly to criticize about Jeffrey, but I think she went overboard and just went very personal about a lot of evolutionary psychology, including my own supervisor David Bussey, who she refers to affectionately David Bussey throughout, and that is definitely not the name of our WhatsApp group for the lab. We're definitely not the Bussey.
We have a little bit of a joke. Love it, guys. Love it.
That's not what everyone calls him in the lab.
We never.
That's not his preferred nickname. Yeah, and Chris Williamson as well. She kind of went out of her way to make fun of him, but she said very little, I think, actually substantive about Chris, who tends to ask very good questions. He brings many people on his show, many famous psychologists from across the board, people with ideas that are
not really from across the board. It's from one side of the board, really.
They're contradictory to one another as well, that might be, you know, representing competing hypotheses and theories and that sort of a thing. A very open platform in that sense, but she really seems to have kind of dug into attacking these individuals personally rather than kind of going into their research in depth or anything.
Oh, so I only made ad hominem arguments about scientists and their personal lives and their personalities. Is that all I did in the entire video? Is that all I did, guys? Is that all I did? Right, okay.
Along with that weight. And I think she's also kind of associated a lot of positions with other outgroup figures and kind of fringe figures. I know she mentioned a dog trainer in there. She has Ben Shapiro in there. I think she has... Who's the other right-wing guy?
Stephen Crowder.
I included such a small clip of a dog trainer in there as an example of this is how evolutionary psychology has like reached out through culture, like so wide. Like it was an example of like this infiltrates everything. And they're like using that as like, oh, she used a dog trainer in her video.
Cliff came in there, Jordan Peterson was in there, anyone kind of seemingly right-wing and bad. I think the goal was to try and position evolutionary psychology as some sort of conservative, goal-aligned move.
Yeah, that's pretty much what it is, though, so I couldn't really help that. Movement,
which is very strange to me because I consider myself personally quite left-wing person. Coming from Ireland, moving to America, a lot of the policies I'd be in favour of are kind of centre-left, left-wing policies. But yeah, this is a strange kind of sleight of hand to kind of guilt by association, associate evolutionary psychology with some bad actors. You know?
Yeah, and like Tara Swart, who's that?
I don't know.
I don't know who that is. We don't know.
I've never heard of it.
These are not people...
Tara Swart!
A lot of this content is not...
Her name sounds like a sweaty fart.
Actually, evolutionary psychology. It's kind of just been introduced. There are many Manosphere people, I think we'll maybe talk about that, but not in a lot of depth. But I mean, evolutionary psychologists are not very happy with the Manosphere at the moment.
Yeah, and that's a whole other podcast.
Yeah, so not much of this video was actually dedicated to actual science material, but this video we're going to do is going to be...
Not much of my video was dedicated to actual science material, apparently. Wow. Wow!
As we tend to do. Much.
The amount of fucking PDFs I had to read for that video. Oh my god.
More in-depth science material. We'll try to explain it in detail, technically, and also to make it understandable for a lay audience. But overall, the video, it's been kind of a masterclass in convincing you through emotions. We'll try to convince you through facts and logic. As Ben Shapiro...
Oh, it's like so fucking... It's so easy to just predict what they're gonna fucking say. Oh, she was only using emotions. I literally cover emotions versus facts in the last part of the video. I literally cover the, like, emotions versus facts. I fucking cover the entire thing and how that whole argument is so fucking bullshit. And they're fucking using it in a debunking of me.
I might say, although I can't say I've ever watched his shows, but tell us about the EEA.
Yeah, so one of the first kind of fundamental misunderstandings of evolutionary psychology in her video centered around this idea of the EEA, the environment of evolutionary adaptedness. And Mooncat seems to suggest that we can't derive any hypotheses about the way the human mind works that are based on our ancestral environment because she thinks we have no idea what that was like. Number one, that's just not true. We have plenty of evidence of what our ancestral environment might have looked like, including current hunter-gatherer societies and small-scale societies that kind of sit...
I covered that in the video! I covered it in that you can't compare current hunter-gatherer societies to ones that happened thousands of years ago.
Similar to our ancestral way of life. If the logic is that the past can't explain the present. We can never use the past to understand what our mind, the selection pressures that our mind evolved in response to, then we might as well throw out all of cosmology. So I don't think we expect Mooncat debunks the Big Bang Theory, even though cosmological evidence is based on millions of years into the past. I mean, and making it just...
Just you fucking wait for my next video, mate. I am gonna debunk the Big Bang Theory next, alright?
Predictions about the way the cosmos work based on that. So yeah, we have a good reason to think that we know somewhat what the environment of evolutionary adaptation...
It's an entirely different field of science. You're talking about physics here. This is so different. Like, you can't make parallels there.
Like, Mooncat also at other times suggests that evolutionary psychology is stuck in the Pleistocene, so that we think that our mind...
The Plasticine.
...evolved primarily...
Pronounce it correctly.
...in this savanna Pleistocene environment. And while that's true, we do think that the majority of our ancestral environment looked like that. Evolutionary psychologists don't think that evolution has stopped operating. It's just that for the vast majority of our ancestral environment, it was more this savanna-like Pleistocene environment. But the environment of evolutionary adaptiveness...
I explain why I disagree with this theory in the video. I do. I explain why I disagree with this.
Is not just a set time or a set place. It's and I'd very much encourage anyone to read the Tooby and Cosmides paper, The Past Explains the President, which is all around evolutionary
The past explains the president. No, it doesn't.
Mismatch and how we can actually use the EEA to make predictions and understand how the human mind operates today. That's a seminal paper from evolutionary psychology. Okay, it's a little bit older, which Mooncat seems to have an issue with, but it's still a seminal paper. So our mind evolved in response to that environment, and it doesn't mean that evolution is ongoing.
I don't think so. I think our minds evolve in response to current cultures, to immediate surroundings. I don't think our minds evolved in this sort of like savannah environment and then we just stuck there. What we did was our minds, like it would take like you would have to be like big brain Wojak to be able to evolve to deal with a certain environment. Like you would need so many fucking synapses to be like, this is what fire is. Oh, this is like, you would need so many synapses for that. So what our brains actually evolved to do is to wire themselves into whatever is currently going around in their environment immediately. And that involves culture. That includes culture. Like, we get wired into culture, like literally as soon as we're born. That's how our brains work, like, so efficiently. Because if we didn't do that, like, we'd have to have like big alien brains. It just wouldn't fucking work. The most efficient way that we can do it is to be born, and then for us to look at our surroundings, and immediately all of our surroundings go into our brains and we go, bang, this is what the world is. That's why childhood trauma is so bad, because like if you wire trauma into a really young child, then it fucks them up for life, because that you've got them at the point of their life where they've evolved to literally wire everything into their brain, like hardwire it in. That's what I believe.
Is not ongoing, but that's the main.
And that's literally what all of our research points towards as well. Like, I'm going off research with everything that I talk about. It's still only a theory, because psychology is a really young field of research. We still don't fucking know so much about the brain, but everything that I'm going off it's based on a growing field of research and growing scientific consensus. And evolutionary psychology, when it has theories about, we evolved to be in a fucking desert and then we stopped, and then all the modern world after that is like an evolutionary mismatch of some sort. None of our research backs that theory up. What our research backs up is that we get born into cultures And when we're babies, when we're tiny little babies or when we're young kids, everything gets fucking hardwired into us pretty fucking quickly.
Environment in which we're evolved in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, she seemed to have a thing with old papers. She brought that up as if that was a bad thing, but many of these are old papers that have actually replicated quite extensively. We will mention that in the future slides as well, and that sort of a thing. What about sexual economics theory, sexual econ theory here? I know she...
Who's going to grant me my honorary PhD? I don't know. Somebody give me my PhD, please. What's he talking about now? Sexual economics. Sex is a female resource for social exchange and heterosexual interactions. Oh, good.
Mentioned that. This was one of the things that she just kind of tried to poke fun at, but what are we looking at here?
Yeah, so sexual economics theory is kind of the crude way to describe it is that women control access to sex as a resource because men really, really want it. And one thing they can do with that high level of sexual desire that men have is that they can monetize it. So Mooncat actually made a tongue-in-cheek comment.
I took one pill, now I've got a PhD. Consistent with the view of sex as a female resource, this is a severe gender imbalance in prostitution. The majority of prostitutes are women, and the vast majority of clients are men. Oh, really?
Is that they can monetize it. So Mooncat actually made a tongue-in-cheek comment of, should I be investing stocks in my own sexuality, as if this was kind of hilarious. But actually, yes,
It was a hilarious joke.
Good. I mean, like, OnlyFans is predominantly female-driven.
No, okay. The joke actually... He's missing the point of the fucking joke. Oh, no. The joke actually was that, I was talking about how women supposedly get more attractive to men when they're ovulating during a certain part of their cycle. And my joke was, I'm about to ovulate. Should I be investing stocks in my own sexuality right now? That was the joke. Oh, he's fucking missing it, man.
Good. I mean, like, OnlyFans is predominantly female-driven, male consumer, overwhelmingly. And that's not just because we've taught women to not buy sex from men. Men buy sex from women cross-culturally.
They take all of this like so literally. That's the problem, though. Like, William Costello sat there like, oh, we've not taught people to do things. I'm not saying we've taught people to do things either. It's culture. It's the way people act around you that teach you how to act. Literally, from the point that you're a fucking baby, a small child, an older child, to a teenager, to an adult, there's people around you just doing shit. They're not telling you to do anything. They're just acting in a certain way. And those people around you that are just acting within a culture, they're wiring things into you. Culture is circular. Like, you act in a certain way, you are passing that down to younger generations. Like, no one's like fucking going around telling kids. No one's going around saying to girls, the way that you're going to make money later on in life is if you sell your body to men. Nobody's literally fucking saying that. Well, at least not in most situations. No one's literally saying that. But that's what we learn. That's what we learn from culture. And that's progressive people try and move beyond that by changing culture. And you're never going to change it if you're just like, oh, well, that's how we're wired, bro.
Cross-historically, anytime you introduce any currency, it's because access to sex from women is a more valuable reproductive resource. So the idea is women control access to sex as a resource, men control access to long-term commitment as a resource, and so it can be exchanged in a type of economics, which seemed to not sit right with...
It's so fucking capitalism brained, isn't it, as well? Everything is an exchange, bro.
With Mooncat, but the idea of market behaviour in relation to any mating behaviour doesn't seem to sit right with a lot of people. A lot of people seem to bristle at the idea of the mating market, and they don't like the idea that our mating behaviour behaves like a market. But
yeah,
it does. There are certain
sure.
traits that are valued less or more. We compete in it, you're chosen in it, and you try and appeal to someone who's going to select you. That's absolutely the way it behaves, and I can't think of a better word. But yeah, so sexual economics theory, there's a reason why my OnlyFans isn't ever going to take off and be very popular, whereas...
Mate, you've not tried. It might. Don't give up.
A lot of women can turn to that and monetize their sexuality in a way that men can't.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think sex ratios are a good example of that as well, and the effect that they have. It's interesting because a lot of research on sex ratios, right, when you have a disproportionate number of men or a disproportionate number of women, this is actually cross-cultural research. So one of the objections was kind of a reliance on weird samples or primarily Western samples, college-educated students and that sort of a thing. But this is very international research across a lot of different populations, and we see kind of how sex ratios impact the market in that sense. You kind of, I'm sure you're very familiar with all of that.
Yeah, for sure. And just like any market, if you're the scarcity in it, you kind of call the shots on how that market behaves. And men are typically...
See, this is true. This is true. Guess what? Guess where it's true? On dating apps. You know why? Because on dating apps, there are less women than there are men. Do you want to know why there's less women than there are men? You don't even need me to tell you why there's less women than there are men on dating apps. It's just, that's how it worked out, and then there was a gender imbalance, and then, yeah, all this shit happened. But it happened in the context of dating apps. It literally didn't happen in real life. If that's how real life sexual dynamics actually happened, there would be more women than men in real life as well. But there isn't. There is an equal number.
Be more short-term oriented, and that was something that Mooncat had an issue with as well, and we'll get into why men are more short-term oriented, but they are, and that's a very consistent finding throughout history, cross-culturally. But also, just to pick up on the weird studies idea. So Mooncat rightfully pointed out that a lot of psychology studies are dependent on weird samples, which means Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. And Joe Henrich had a very famous paper that found that 96% of psychology participants in the studies come from a weird country, which just weird countries house just 12% of the world's population. Now, evolutionary psychology is far less egregious on this front. Some of the seminal papers from the 80s and all the way through until the current day, evolutionary psychology papers consist of 30 to 50 cultures, 30 to 50 different countries. That is very...
14 nations, 37 nations? I mean, what nations are those, really?
unheard of compared to most social psychology. So just to put an actual figure on it, I think evolutionary psychology...
But the thing is, though, like, even though you say, yeah, we did studies across loads of different cultures, the thing is, most countries are less developed than the West. So, like, you can be like, yeah, people are mostly studied Western countries, but, like, even if you studied other cultures, most of them are sort of like, they're less developed than Western cultures, so the gender differences are probably even wider than the ones in the Western countries. So I do think it's a lot of it is like the cultures that are prominent in most countries in the world right now, because we're a very sort of globalized economy. Our cultures bleed into each other across the whole of the world. They just do. Even in hunter-gatherer societies, which are supposedly not affected by Western cultures, they absolutely are. Loads of them live like right next to Western societies. Like, the cultures bleed into each other constantly.
It has a long way to go in getting less weird, but we're far less egregious than most of social psychology. So I think it was in the latest analysis, something like 85% of evolutionary psychology samples could be classified as weird. And that's a problem. We need to maybe improve on that, but it's certainly nowhere close to the 96% for the rest of psychology. So again, I don't see why that's a unique sin of evolutionary psychology.
Yeah, that's something I...
Did I say it was a unique sin of psychology? I think I made it quite obvious that the entirety of psychology is a very flawed scientific subject.
I noticed throughout watching her video as well that a lot of the objections she raised about sample sizes, weird samples.
Very common error. Most objections applied. I don't think I ever said that they didn't. I don't think I was saying that at all.
Replication. These are issues to psychology as a field across the board. They're not specific to evolutionary psychology, and in many ways evolutionary psychology is better. We'll talk about sample sizes. I pulled some examples of that as well, but yeah, so that's kind of some broad...
That whole section in the middle about how It's called Science is Fucked. There's a whole section called Science, not Evolutionary Psychology, Science is Fucked. That chapter of the video is called Science is Fucked. I'm not even talking about just psychology. I'm talking about science as a whole is fucked.
Things that we saw watching this video. Let's go on now to the next.
One more thing,
yes, go
Alex,
ahead.
before we go on the replication crisis. And evolutionary psychology is relatively immune to this replication crisis. So evolutionary psychology, and our lab is writing a paper on this at the moment actually, has a unique style of replicability. So not only do we find pinpoint effects in a lab and replicate them over and over again in multiple different labs around the world, we can do that, but what evolutionary psychology does is we find a converging line of evidence, like a net of evidence from different sub-disciplines. So that's a unique standard for a field to hold itself towards, and which is directly contra to this accusation of evolutionary psychology as being unfalsifiable, just so stories that isn't very well evidenced. I don't know of any other subfield of psychology that necessitates triangulating hunter-gatherer evidence, survey data, behavioral data, experimental data, developmental. And there's a really good paper.
He just doesn't understand how, like, even all of that data could be, like, just so biased by current culture. Like, this is what I cover in the video. He's like, oh, we go from survey data, from hunter-gatherer society data. All of that data, all of it is seen through the lens of the current culture that you're collecting that data in. You don't understand this.
Paper from David Schmidt on this about how we recognize an evolved psychological adaptation and the converging lines of evidence that you need for that. So that's again, evolutionary psychology much less egregious than any other type of psychology there.
Yeah, that's true. Very good points there. Very good. Contrasting evolutionary psychology with the standard social science model, right? Often called kind of the blank slate. You've done this in a recent paper, actually, haven't you? What did you kind of find there?
I never. If he's going to start saying that I advocated for the blank slate theory, I never fucking did. I never said I'm a blank slatist.
Yeah, so we had a recent paper came out that found that the standard social science model, or the blank slate kind of view of the mind, when it was compared by one author to evolutionary psychology, it appeared at first to be outpacing evolutionary psychology, and it looked like most people were not adopting the evolutionary psychology lens to their work. Now, we published a paper last week kind of reanalyzing the data there, and we find that there's actually no outpacing, that the two models are actually growing at a similar rate, and evolutionary psychology is gaining a foothold in psychology. But what's very interesting to me about the standard social science model is that it never concedes when evolutionary psychology has a victory over it. So, for example, you take something like the gender equality paradox, which is the finding that, paradoxically, on the standard social science model account, some sex differences get larger in more gender egalitarian countries.
I fucking covered this in the video as well! Is he going to say that?
And that is precisely...
There's a whole section on it! On the frickin' STEM studies! On the women in STEM!
the opposite of what the standard social science model, or the blank slate, everything is
I covered how much of a bullshit study this was.
learned from culture
I literally explained it.
model
Did they watch my video?
would predict. And still, there has been no concession from standard social science model scholars that the evolutionary view, which can explain this paradox, that when you're actually freed up, you can act on your evolved preferences more so. That's why we have bigger sex differences in gender egalitarian countries like Norway, Denmark and Sweden. There still has been no concession from standard social science model scholars. And I wager that...
Because they looked at it and they saw that the study was bullshit. It was completely cooked numbers.
if the findings were the other way around, that if sex differences diminished in more gender egalitarian countries, this would be shouted from the rooftop as a win for the standard social science model. So it's like a very unfair fight insofar as we keep kind of being more predictively powerful but never getting any credit for it.
Yeah, it's interesting.
No, like the people that made that study, what's the name of he was called David Geary. One of the guys who authored that study was called David Geary. And he started out his career. He's always been an evolutionary psychologist, and he's always been a bit of a misogynist, and he's always been trying to sort of scientifically figure out why men are better than women, specifically at STEM subjects. And he started out his career writing studies about where he'd supposedly found that men are better than women at STEM studies. That's how he started out his career. And he started out his career writing out, this is what we found. Men are better than women at STEM subjects. This is what we found. And this is clearly because evolutionarily, blah, 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 men needed to do this back in the Pleistocene. And then, recently, what we've done somehow culturally is we've allowed women to catch up with men, even overtake men in STEM subjects. We proved him wrong. We proved David Geary wrong. But we are still marred with the problem of women do not go into STEM jobs as much as men do. This is clearly a cultural issue because they feel like they're a little bit pushed out of these jobs for whatever reason. This is a cultural issue that, things like DEI are going to have to fix. But because David Geary was proved wrong, women are not actually worse at STEM than men. What he now actually does with his career is he tries to prove why women actually don't emotionally want to do STEM. Even though they can do it a bit better than men, he's conceded that women can at least do STEM as well as, or even better than men now. He's now trying to figure out why, scientifically, evolutionarily, women just don't emotionally want to do STEM as much as men do. Basically, his entire career is just like looking at cultural problems and trying to make them working back and trying to make them evolutionary. It's just, he can't just admit he's wrong.
Interesting. I see some similarities there, kind of between the way the Manosphere clings to old hypotheses and also kind of to the SSSM in that sense that when older findings are not replicating, when the evidence is not kind of showing those, they just kind of stick to it and continue to shift the goalposts, which is, we'll talk about some of this ovulatory shift research in evolutionary psychology that has not replicated, but that's not something that evolutionary psychologists tend to do. When something doesn't replicate, it's typically, you move on from that, you come up with something else. But what about modularity of the mind? I think she kind of was making fun of that a little bit, this idea that the mind has evolved some domain-specific modules to solve kind of adaptive problems in that.
Yeah, so evolutionary psychology suggests that we have specialist psychological mechanisms to solve specific problems. Maybe the blank slate kind of theory of the mind is that we have a domain general learning mechanism that learns everything from culture, that it comes equipped with some very, very basic instincts and the rest is kind of learned from culture. But she actually poked fun at one idea that in evolutionary psychology, we never see learning and evolved as competing hypotheses for a behavior or for a psychological tendency, because we come equipped with evolved psychological mechanisms for certain types of learning. So John Tooby, who passed away recently, he had a famous quote where he said, "Students often ask me, which caused the behavior, instinct or learning?" And he said, a better question is, which instinct caused the learning? So we have key developmental periods where we learn certain behaviors. So we all have a universal learning mechanism to learn language, but we don't have the same language. So it depends on what environmental input you get in. But this idea of critical windows for learning certain types of behavior is uncontroversial in developmental psychology. So the idea that Mooncat was kind of sneering at that idea seemed very strange to me.
I sneered at specifically one person's idea of modular theory. What's his name? The guy with the curly grey hair. What's his name? It's escaped me now. The guy with the crazy curly hair, the grey Gandalf. Steven Pinker, that's him. I sneered at his because he has an entire list of supposed mind modules that humans have, which is fucking ridiculous. I do believe that we have traits. I call them traits, and I think we have a few specific ones. Yes, one of them is language, and it very much is down to your environment, how you learn language. Obviously, like one of them is sexuality, and one of them is, I don't know, I can't think of another one, but you know what I mean. There's a few sort of very basic ones, but like when you're a kid, they get like they get wired into you, like how to use each of these traits gets wired into you when you're like really quite young. You learn a lot of things. He's saying that I'm sneering at the whole idea of like mind modularity. I don't like to call it mind modularity. I don't think that's really the correct way of describing it.
There's also something about that some psychological mechanisms require activation by your input. So an analogy I would draw there is, think of calluses on your hand. No one would doubt that every human has the ability to create calluses, but you may never need to. If you don't encounter abrasion to your hands, you may never produce a callus. You may never produce that behavior or that effect. So does that mean that human didn't have those genes? No, of course they did. They just needed the environmental input. So we are evolved to learn. We come equipped with certain learning mechanisms for certain types of content. Language is a good one. And learning versus evolved is absolutely not a conflict at all. We would actually predict that that's the way the mind works.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's something a lot of people get wrong kind of in the nature versus nurture debate. They tend to think that it's one or the other, but it's always kind of an interaction between genes and environment. I mean, that's considered just axiomatic.
I literally say this in the video. I say it's like your traits are influenced by both your genes and your environment. I literally say that in the video.
In personality psychology now, the idea that it is these two things and it's the interaction of them that produces phenotypic expression. Mm-hmm. But I wonder to what extent Mooncat actually believes in a real blank slate. It seems like she kind of leans in that direction, but certainly kind of in popular culture or folk psychology, a lot of people continue to believe in the blank slate. I think it's important that they know, like, across psychology broadly, that is out. And yeah, and even things like developmental periods. I mean, this is not from evolutionary psychology originally. We observed these developmental periods, critical periods for learning and development, long before there was perhaps an evolutionary perspective on that. But understanding it in an evolutionary perspective explains it a lot better, doesn't it?
Yeah, and just this idea of the blank slate versus the evolutionary, this is where I get back to the creationist style of thinking. It's kind of like putting things in air quotations and saying evolved or ancestral environment and kind of making a joke of it. It's not an argument. And actually it's preposterous to think of the other argument. It's preposterous to suggest that our mind operates, evolution applies just from the neck down. That just seems so strange.
I literally never said this.
Or that maybe evolution doesn't apply anymore to us, that our base instincts are just all very deep lizard brain that we no longer have any relevance. I don't know what really she thinks, because she never puts forward a clear alternative theory. She just...
What? That's the entire last part of the video!
kind of thumbs her nose at evolutionary thinking.
Yeah, it's very strange. People seem to think that we're very different and special compared to other animals, or even that we're not animals. That seems almost to be implicit in a lot of the way people think, even if they probably don't reject the theory of evolution explicitly.
I swear though, a lot of haters, like right-wing dudes, Manosphere dudes, whatever, what they will do with my videos is they will watch the first 30 minutes and they'll be like, oh, this was all just jokes. You're just a child making jokes. This is all just conjecture. This is all just ad hominem bullshit. Like, you clearly watched the first chapter of my video and you assumed that the whole thing was just me fucking about, which fair enough, the start of the video is. But then we get down to business, bitches, and you need to have the fucking attention span.
They form beliefs and look at the world. That's kind of what they think of. But it's, you see all of this animal behavior, and then you have to kind of ask, is this due to animal culture, or is it due to animal instincts and their behavior and kind of their evolved predispositions?
Yeah, are the male chimps taught to be desire more sexual variety than the female chimps? Is that patriarchy that's imposed on the male chimps? Maybe. Maybe.
Yeah, across animal species we see that. Much more selectivity in females, much less selectivity in sexual variety in males. And it's certainly one of those things, like you mentioned in the past slide, this is something that is replicated in human behavior extensively with a very large sex difference. I believe Cohen's D of about 0.7 to 0.9. That men have a much stronger interest in sexual variety than women do.
Yeah, it's one of the findings in all of psychology, not just evolutionary psychology. And it makes total sense, because We only expect to see sex differences in psychology when there's a different selection pressure acting differently on women than men. So men and women solve the adaptive problem of getting food into their body in the exact same way, because the selection pressure affects them both the same way. Sex is such a different animal for women, and certainly was ancestrally, than for men. It would be astounding if evolution didn't also give differing psychology. So the analogy I would draw is that given the
only thing that we have proved with evidence when it comes to women's sexuality, the only thing that we have empirically proved through all of the research is that we get a little bit more horny when we're ovulating. That makes sense. That makes sense. And that's the only thing that we've proved. We don't get horny for different jaw shapes. We don't get more horny for like guys with little plaits coming down the back of their nothing. We just generally get more horny. If we're already attracted to rat tails and weird goatees, then when we're ovulating, we will just be more attracted to rat tails and weird little goatees.
Massive biological reproductive differences around sex between men and women. If selection gave us those biological differences without any corresponding psychological differences attending to those biological differences, that would be like evolution selecting for a body that's capable of bipedal locomotion with all the anatomy and everything, but no psychological inclination to walk. It just doesn't make sense. It just doesn't make sense.
Yeah, precisely. There's no question that evolution has shaped the human mind. There can be questions on how specifically it has done it, but we see it across all animals, and that's the case for us as well as, animals ourselves.
Yeah, and those findings about the sex differences in desire for sexual variety, they're so large, like an effect size of a D of 8 or 9, that's like the effect size of the difference in upper body strength between men and women on average. Like those are extremely strong, high in magnitude, highly replicable findings.
Yeah, the way I came across evolutionary psychology initially was studying relationships. I didn't have an evolutionary perspective, and I realized anytime you read research on romantic relationships, human relationships, sex, they're always citing evolutionary psychologists because it's been so incredibly influential in understanding human relationships that there's almost, a very large overlap at this point where it's like you're not going to study sex or relationships without an evolutionary perspective.
Yeah, we're a sexually reproducing species. Every single one of us is here today because an unbroken chain of our ancestors solved the problem of mating for long enough to reproduce. It's a big problem, so it's number one issue in people's minds.
My answer to that is, I explained this in the video, but just to recap, one of the traits that we have traits such as we all have 2 arms, we all have 2 legs, we all have a head in much the same way. We all have the trait of sexuality. Within that trait is variance. And what genes do and what evolution made genes do is create as much variance as possible, because within a species there is robustness in variation. So like your genes, like such as how long your legs are, or how curly your hair is, or what color your skin is, or what color your hair is, whatever, there is variance in genes within traits, and there is variance within the trait of sexuality. Sexuality is a trait because, yes, it helps us reproduce, but it expresses itself in varied ways, extremely varied ways, because that's what evolution does. It makes as much variance as possible because that makes us robust. So if some fucking awful shit happened one day and I don't know, some fucking awful tornado came down and killed everyone that was straight and only left people that were bisexual on Earth, well, you know what? The human race survived, didn't it? That's why evolution makes variance. So people with certain genes, at least some people with certain genes, make it through most things. That's why we have variance. We don't make bottlenecks of genes because that would make us less robust as a species. So sexuality is one of the traits that makes variance. Over time, it's only going to get more and more and more and more varied as we keep on fucking each other randomly. We're just going to get more and more and more variance. And sexuality is a trait which has a lot of variance within it. Same goes for your gender identity. The same goes for loads of shit. You have traits in your brain as much as you have traits in your body. The sexuality trait was not evolved to be like, ooh, I'm a woman, therefore I'm attracted to man. That's not how it works. It wants and it needs variance for robustness. I explain this in the video, and I don't know if they're gonna fucking refute that or if they even fucking watched it, but...
And so the evolutionary view can be enormously informative, particularly in mating, but across all domains. But I'm most interested in mating anyway.
Yeah. So going on now to the next slide. We mentioned this, you mentioned this, nut picking a little bit, and here's kind of a paper, I'll put it up, that
he did mean to say nut picking. The fallacious tactic of picking out and showcasing the nuttiest members of a group as the best representatives of that group. Hence, picking the nut. Okay.
Use as an
Who was the nut that I picked?
example. This was, I think there's only 2 or 3 papers on this by the same researchers, but it was kind of the idea that oral sex of
Oh, yeah. So I picked some pretty fucking silly studies. But they were funny.
Involved is sperm detection. I don't know if I've made a video on this, but I've been a little critical of this in the past. These are good psychologists that did this, okay? So Todd Shackelford, a very famous evolutionary psychologist. I think it's a reasonable hypothesis. And I think this is something that Mooncat kind of went through this video. She made fun of all these hypotheses, like, oh, that's so dumb. So she's just making fun of things. But any question is reasonable. You can make a hypothesis, you can test it, you can see if it turns out true or not. I didn't think it was especially well designed to test that hypothesis. I'm not going to get into the details of why. But it's easy to make fun of. She didn't really explain why it was bad, though. I'm not sure she understands methodology that well to do that.
I think, my overall point with all of these stupid studies was the sample size was generally below 10 on a lot of them, if not below 40.
Didn't really seem like it. But this is kind of an example of nut picking. Explain what that is. Is this something that, this kind of paper, is this something that you think is representative of evolutionary psychology?
So yeah, no, I don't think it's representative, but all fields will have some misses, some duds, some bad science, some badly run studies, for sure. So if you pick the most extreme examples of something that didn't work out as representative, of course you can make any field look bad. But the great late John Tooby, there's a recent issue of the journal Evolution Human Behaviour that has a series of his quotes and how meaningful they were. And one of the main ones that stood out was this idea of entertain all hypotheses. Many hypotheses that turn out to be true sounded ridiculous at the time and were ferociously ridiculed. And we should try and override that, because if you hamstring yourself only into what is kind of acceptable to consider in contemporary society, then you'll never actually discover new knowledge. Also, it seems to be holding evolutionary psychology to a unique standard in that we can never miss. Like, we can't actually, or if we go for a theory and don't find evidence for it and abandon it and go for a different theory, that means the field is entirely debunked. That is just a standard that you would never hold any other psychology to. That's how.
Did I do that though? I'm pretty sure that I took every theory that you had and debunked it. I didn't just take one. I'm pretty sure I took them all and debunked them all.
All science is done. You form a hypothesis, you make your predictions from that theoretical framework, and you try and find evidence for it. And if you don't persist with that theory. So yeah, we should entertain all hypotheses. Also, in evolutionary psychology, there's competing hypotheses often, and that's normal science again, but it seems to be kind of ridiculed, a normal part of science that's ridiculed when applied to evolutionary psychology. It's very strange.
Yeah, and kind of like you mentioned, if we look at replication rates and all that, evolutionary psychology is doing pretty well. If you want to ridicule things for their
You know why? Because it's measuring culture. Evolutionary psychology studies are measuring culture. What the hell? Whatever the fuck is going on in culture right now. That's why they replicate so well.
We can just look at social psychology broadly. Do you remember power poses? The idea that, if you did your power pose, then you would be more confident. They were very influential things, kind of coming from this blank slate model.
It's like the easiest way of getting a psychology study replicated. If you're measuring something that people are kind of aware that they're supposed to be doing anyway, that's the easiest way to like get a study to be replicated. Like other psychology studies are harder to be replicated because they're trying to test in what situations, you know, people are more likely to cheat or like be dishonest or be disgusted or whatever. But like whenever it's something that people aren't aware that they're supposed to be doing, when people then try and replicate that to a wider study, they will generally find that when they take it to different cultures, they can't replicate it anymore. If it's a sort of understood thing in that culture that you're not meant to act that way, they'll generally find that in psychology, there's no like universal way that people will act. It's always very wired into like the culture that they're brought up in.
Then you would be more confident. They were very influential things kind of coming from this blank slate model that didn't have any evolutionary rationale behind them. Like, why would you even, someone just came up with it and stuck with it. And it turns out a lot of these kind of seminal findings not in evolutionary psychology did not replicate, probably because they did not have kind of good theory behind it to begin with.
Exactly right. So there's a lot of reasons for the replication crisis, maybe bad incentives in science to kind of publish novel findings and, you know, lots of different reasons, p-hacking, things like that. But one is this lack of theoretical framework. And Joe Henrich and Michael Murthy-Krishna wrote a paper on this. A lack of good theory is a major contributor to the replication crisis. And evolutionary psychology actually could be perhaps an antidote to that, because our findings are generally pretty...
There's many reasons for the replication crisis. I think it's mostly to do with the way that we just do science as a whole. The way that we don't decide what a study's going to be beforehand and then say, okay, we're going to carry it out in this way without changing anything. Because what scientists tend to do is if they start getting results back from their study and they don't back up what they thought that they would get, generally they will psychologically, completely unknowingly, they will put more weight behind the results of that study that they expected, and they will generally discard the results that they didn't expect, and then they will give themselves some kind of reason for that, like, oh well, this result must have come back because I didn't measure this person's answers or put enough weight behind this person's answers, or I put too much weight behind this person's answers when I was building my statistical model or whatever. There are so many ways that you can cook data that you don't even fucking realize that you're doing as a scientist. And we have to figure out ways to like work around human bias in science. And we've literally not figured out how to do that yet.
Replicable. We don't tend to want to persist with a theory if it's not replicated. And again, yeah, it just seems to be that if evolutionary psychology has a finding there's this conception of evolutionary psychology that it's unfalsifiable. We were working on a paper in our lab where we actually showed that that's not the case, where we go through maybe 4 or 5 different theories that are well falsified within evolutionary psychology. And that's good. That's normal. You should try and falsify your own theories, try and find evidence of alternative theories. But it seems like people don't allow evolutionary psychology to do that without saying, oh, that's evidence that it's all debunked. And that's just very strange to me.
Yeah. So if people don't understand, you have a theory, which is kind of like the broad explanation for phenomena. Then you have hypotheses, like the specific things that you want to test. But if you need a theory, I mean, the theory of evolution is a pretty good place to start, you know, as far as just coming up with something from the blank slate or out of the blue. I mean, we know that, you know, evolution is real. The theory of evolution certainly has a lot behind it at this point.
Well, I hope we know. I thought we knew until this video.
Until this video, now I don't know. But I'm waiting for the debunking the Big Bang.
Yeah.
So that's going to be a hit.
All right, that's the one I'm going to do next.
So if people don't understand, you have a theory, which is kind of like the broad explanation for phenomena. Then you have hypotheses, like the specific things that you want to test. But if you need a theory, I mean, the theory of evolution is a pretty good place to start, you know, as far as just coming up with something from the blank slate or out of the blue. I mean, we know that, you know, evolution is real. The theory of evolution certainly has a lot behind it at this point.
Well, I hope we know. I thought we knew until I watched this video.
Until this video, now I don't know. But I'm waiting for the debunking the Big Bang.
Yeah.
So that's going to be a hit. So
yeah, these guys want me to debunk the Big Bang Theory, which, yeah, I'm up for that. I'll do it.
Talking a little bit more about the female orgasm and all that, I think she mentioned as well this Upsuck hypothesis, right? That the idea that the female orgasm evolved, because this is another thing we're making fun of, right? Is kind of the evolution of the orgasm. I mean, the fact that, you know, we experience orgasms, men and women. It's not clear that all animals, or particularly that all animals do, or that all female animals do, even when male animals do. It's not clear that that's the case. So we do have to ask, why did this evolve? It obviously did evolve physically. It's a physical process that evolved apart from the psychology of it. So then we can ask, like, why? Why did this sort of thing evolve? One of these hypotheses was the Upsuck hypothesis, the idea that orgasm helps to transport sperm into, the uterus, that sort of a thing, to facilitate impregnation.
I love how they never consider, they never even consider that it could be because women might also want to be able to enjoy sex. Like the reason that women might consider consenting to sex is because they also enjoy it and they're also wanting that orgasm. That they never really seem to even consider that as a theory.
All of that.
There has to be some sort of underlying manipulative reason for it, such as she will decide to orgasm with one guy but not with another guy, and the reason that she decides to orgasm with a particular guy is because she'd rather suck up his sperm into her womb than the other guy.
Looked into this stuff.
Because he has more superior sperm. It's not that deep, guys. It's not that clever and it's not that deep. Literally with you guys, it's probably not that deep.
Done some threads and collections of papers and all of that. I think there's maybe good evidence against that being the case, but she didn't seem to explain that either, did she? She just kind of made fun of this Upsuck thing, and I think she said Upsuck in a funny way, and everyone laughed.
And again, just kind of...
I don't think I even said Upsuck. Hang on, what did they say?
Evidence against that being the case, but she didn't seem to explain that either, did she? She just kind of made fun of this Upsuck thing, and I think...
I made fun of the Upsuck guy. She made fun of the Upsuck.
She said Upsuck in a funny way, and everyone laughed.
I don't think I even said the word Upsuck. Hello, Raiders. I don't even think I said... You came in at a great time. I didn't even mention the word Upsuck.
And again, just kind of whatever about what actually turns out to be maybe true, or the best evidence kind of suggests about the function of female orgasm, that's complicated, and researchers should get into the weeds about that to try and figure it out. She didn't suggest any hypotheses of her own, certainly, but the idea, she said that there's about 15 different evolutionary explanations for this, and they're all debunked.
Guys, I'm guessing most of the people in chat probably have penis, right? You don't know what it's like to have a vagina, right? And have an orgasm, but they're when you post orgasm, there is a sort of mechanism that you can feel happening where there's a sort of you sort of feel like a pulsation sensation post orgasm, and I'm guessing that's the Upsuck that they're talking about. But even so, I can't imagine how that would I can't imagine how it would even encourage. I can't imagine how it would encourage, what you would have to do is you'd have to do a sort of a headstand to really encourage it. You'd have to do a headstand to get it up there,
And it's okay, good. We're trying to come up with theories. It's a bit of a puzzle. It's not a straightforward explanation for why it would exist. It's not clear that it exists in other mammals. So yeah.
It's easy to make fun of things and debunk them. It's harder to come up with good explanations and demonstrate those through the scientific method and all of that. So I think there is stronger evidence at the moment for kind of a pair bonding function for the female orgasm, right? That the orgasm can help to select mates during the sexual process, that sort of a thing, and also to retain mates long term. And I mean, this is something
why women have orgasms. Well, honestly, I think humans evolved them in general because we're too sort of cognizant to do things purely for instinctual reasons, especially something as kind of disgusting as sex. If you think about it, if we didn't enjoy sex, if we didn't get any pleasure out of sex, if you think about it, we would not want to do it. It's kind of icky. If we did not get any pleasurable feeling out of sex. If you think about it, you're kind of messing around with someone's dirty, you know, like wrinkly testicles. I would not get anywhere near them if it weren't for, you know, the actual enjoyment part of sex. So I think we're like, as humans, we sort of like, our brains got too big and we got a little bit too cognizant to realize that sex is actually kind of weird and disgusting. So I think we kind of evolved. I think we did evolve the sort of pleasurable feeling from it to counteract that. I just think that all humans did it all together at once. I don't think women and men evolved it in different ways. I think just humans evolved a sort of pleasurable feeling for sex for that reason, because we're too cognizant to just sort of see something as like a instinctual thing that we should just do. I think that we had to find pleasure in it to be able to exist as a species. But I don't think that like men and women evolved that pleasure separately and differently. I think we evolved it in a similar way. And that's why I think that both like people who were born with male genitals and people that were born with female genitals both evolved the orgasm for the exact same reason. That's what I believe.
Something, you know, it's interesting because I think people coming more maybe from a left-wing perspective or even a blank slate perspective, they'd say, why don't you ask women what they think and all of that? And I mean, if you ask women, you know, are you more likely to stay in a relationship with someone who gives you orgasms consistently or not? Mm-hmm. So that's kind of evidence for that, you know, that we see women orgasm at much higher rates when they are in long-term committed relationships as opposed to just during hookups and that sort of a thing.
Hello, we're talking about female orgasms, Raiders. Yeah, women are more likely to stay in relationships with men who make them orgasm for very extremely obvious reasons. Extremely obvious reasons. Because obviously they're listening to what they like in bed, and then they are acting on what that woman says that they like in bed. That is quite simply it.
What do you think about, perhaps, what's the most convincing explanation for you for the female orgasm?
I think certainly, and Mooncat even suggested it. It's like, why don't you maybe think about a partner who listens to what their partner wants and what they likes in bed? All those are cues to good long-term mating qualities. And that's all we have as animals in this world, is picking up cues to qualities. So certainly, yeah, the ability to figure out what gives my partner an orgasm requires a lot of long-term mating qualities. So I think that makes sense to me. But
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I agree. And so she's just kind of making fun of things. She's like, well, maybe the clitoris is just for pleasure. I mean, evolutionary psychologists don't deny that the clitoris
so are parts of the dick
is for pleasure, but
so are the balls. So is like the skin. The skin is the biggest erogenous zone in your body. So like, what's the point in you having skin?
You have to ask, like, why did we evolve an organ for pleasure? What is the function of that? What is the purpose of that? Why do we have it? Why do some animals not have it? Why do some animals probably, have a clitoris but maybe not experience orgasm, but others do? Even why is there individual variation in orgasm between women, that some can achieve orgasm much more easily?
I don't know. Why do some women achieve orgasm more easily than others? It could be that can be down to personal experience with sexuality. It can be down to genes, or it could be down to the men that she's been trying to have orgasms with.
Others cannot, etc., etc.
And ironically, just saying, oh, well, it's there for pleasure is kind of a just so story, right? It's just so. We just have a clitoris for pleasure. Well, I don't. But
yeah, it just happened to happen. And I mean, that's even one of the evolutionary explanations for it, is that the clitoris is essentially vestigial. It's just there. It doesn't have any function at all. Maybe it just serves for pleasure now. But yeah.
It doesn't have any function at all, mate. It has a very, very, very large function. All right? It has a very important function.
It is really just kind of a just so story there. But yeah, that's something throughout her video, I think, is that she offers very few alternative explanations, which is kind of typical of people that are trying to debunk something instead of trying to kind of contribute to the body of knowledge more broadly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Let's go on now and see what else we have here. So certainly at the beginning of her video and all throughout it, she kind of makes these links between evolutionary psychology and the Manosphere. My kind of big thing, and it's not what I set out intending to do, but it's certainly become that, is kind of like, how does the Manosphere get evolutionary psychology wrong? So certainly I'm not a big fan of Manosphere, black pill, red pill, a lot of the time I take to devote, if people have seen the website, is explaining what they get wrong about these things. So there's a lot of conflating that. What do evolutionary psychologists kind of think about the manosphere and all of these pills at the moment?
Yeah, so we essentially think that they're maybe bastardizing a lot of our findings. So one major point of contention is...
Hey, actually, I just realised I got a super chat. Appreciate the dedication to the debunking! Oh, thank you.
That red pill gurus don't accept that evolutionary psychology, or many evolutionary psychologists, move on from the dual mating hypothesis to the mate switching hypothesis. And, Mooncat seemed to criticize evolutionary...
None of you have shouted at me for not having the subtitles on. What is going on? What is going on? Why are you not shouting at me for that?
Psychology for doing that as well. So she's in a strange bedfellow with Manosphere content creators there, which is maybe news to her. But so essentially the dual mating hypothesis...
Hey, what's news to me? Sorry, I got distracted.
Well, so she's in...
What?
From the dual mating hypothesis to the mate switching hypothesis. And, Mooncat seemed to criticize evolutionary psychology for doing that as well. So she's in a strange bedfellow with Manosphere content creators there, which is maybe news to her. But so essentially
I'm absolutely not following.
They think that they're maybe bastardizing a lot of our findings. So one major point of contention is that red pill gurus don't accept that evolutionary psychology, or many evolutionary psychologists, move on from the dual mating hypothesis to the mate switching hypothesis. And, Mooncat seemed to criticize evolutionary psychology for doing that as well. So she's in a strange bedfellow with Manosphere content creators there, which is maybe news to her. But so essentially...
Chat, are you confused as well?
Actually, the dual mating hypothesis was...
I'm a strange bedfellow to confusion right now. Also, here's Brooklyn's asshole. And here he is scratching the fucking chair again.
Totally a hypothesis that makes sense, theoretically, a logical one, that women would mate with one person for long-term mating and mate with another man for short-term mating. Kind of have this dual sexuality framework. Because you do see that in other ape species as well, like chimpanzees. But it turned out to be not well evidenced. And there was theories that the ovulatory shifts, that when women are ovulating, their preferences for different type of men would come online. And again...
I completely debunked that.
The accumulating evidence didn't point towards that. So we began to notice that the evidence, or David, my supervisor, began to notice that the evidence favoured more of the mate switching hypothesis. That is, when women commit infidelity, that it's typically with a view to move to a different relationship. They fall in love with their affair partners.
Oh, yeah. So they switched their hypothesis when they realised that the wider information, the wider data, didn't support their original hypothesis. Because they were like, oh shit, it's actually not supported by data that when women are ovulating, they're attracted to different kinds of men, like different jaw shapes, as to when they're not ovulating. So we're going to change this and say that what they're actually doing is looking for... Oh shit, I can't remember what it was now. He's going to say...
You to move to a different relationship. They fall in love with their affair partners. They're unhappy in their own relationship as a motive for the infidelity. And that's not the case for men. So the evidence seemed to suggest a more mate switching hypothesis. But again...
Yeah, so they changed their hypothesis to say that women are actually looking to fall in love with the people who they're in an affair with. Whatever hypothesis that they come to, it's always misogynistic. It's always the women are doing some kind of manipulative bullshit to do over the men in some way.
This is a fundamental difference between evolutionary psychologists and the Manosphere, who persist with the dual mating hypothesis. So it's evolutionary psychologists that debunk their own theory of the dual mating, so like good scientists should do. So I don't know what that says about how evolutionary psychology is operating, but yeah.
Yeah, exactly. It's kind of this...
I mean, what it's saying is when your own theory is debunked, what you will do is you will just replace it with a theory that is still misogynistic and is going against what the growing scientific consensus is. And what you do is you desperately try and still work within the framework of evolutionary psychology, which is the general theory of of men are looking for a variety of genes and women are looking for high status genes. Like, that's the general theory, that's the general framework that you work within evolutionary psychology. But like the growing body of research within genetics as a whole is there is nothing in place that makes you want to mate in any certain way. What genes want to do is spread and mix up as much as possible. That's what genes want to do. They want to variate. They want to create variants. That is what genes want to do, and that is what the growing consensus is around genetic science. They want to be as varied as possible. That's what genes want. They don't want to bottle themselves. They don't, like, there is no one. This is why Dawkins is wrong. Like, the gene, like, there is no one gene that wants to survive. Like, that's what we used to think decades ago. True, that's what we used to think. But growing scientific consensus is that's not actually true. There is no one gene that wants to carry on through generations. What genes actually want is to create variants. So what's actually beneficial is all of us fucking each other randomly. Like, literally, what your genes want to do is just fuck the most random person you can find. The most random fucking, like, unexpected person that you could ever come across. Your genes want you to fuck that random person. That's what they want. They don't want the chiseled jaw. Your genes don't want, the most alpha dude. What they want, chaos theory. Your genes want you to fuck the most random person that you come across. That is what the scientific consensus is saying genetically. That's what they want you to do. They want you to fuck the most random person that comes across your path. And I'm not I'm not advocating that you do that. Be safe out there. Be safe.
Association with the Manosphere and pulling these...
Consent is king. Anyway.
But it's almost like if we picked the most extreme examples of left-wing thought or whatever and said, this is what it is. It's, well, like you said, kind of like nut-picking there. So let's see, let's go on here. So she does kind of do a lot of mockery throughout this video and all of that. We mentioned the developmental periods, kind of mockery of that is something that was well observed even before taking an evolutionary perspective and all of that. I think some as well that she kind of mocked is kind of related to your research on incels and monogamy. What was that? Do you remember?
Yeah, so she kind of seemed to thumb her nose at this idea that one of the main cultural advantages of monogamy is that it results in a more egalitarian distribution of mates. Historically, we have a deep ancestral history of polygyny, meaning that the most high status man, preferential polygyny, whereby the most high status man in a society would accumulate more wives, multiple wives, and that would inevitably mean there's more incels. Some men would be left out. As cultures got more complex, cultures that began to practice a cultural norm of monogamy, meaning that there were fewer incels, they began to flourish more than the ones that persisted with polygyny. Now, bear in mind, we have 83% of human societies ever recorded have been preferentially polygynous. Now, most mateships in those societies were monogamous. Most men could not.
83%, did he say?
Now, bear in mind, we have 83% of human societies ever recorded have been preferentially polygynous. Now, most mateships in those societies were monogamous. Most men could not accumulate enough resources to support multiple wives. But
where is he getting this information from?
Most men could not accumulate enough resources to support multiple wives. But it's an uncontroversial finding in evolutionary psychology, in cross-cultural psychology, in anthropology, that monogamy, one of the main cultural advantages is fewer incels, essentially, because incels are very troublesome in your society. So
this is where it comes from with the whole Vikings thing. It's like, oh, incels come from Viking times because they were pissed off that they couldn't get any women because the system wasn't in place for them to get women anymore. They were like cooks. They were betas. You had loads of Vikings that were betas.
One very civilizing force on them is actually getting married. So, that is whether it's very palatable or not, it is a historical fact. I mean, that's uncontroversial finding in anthropology here.
Yeah, I mean, it makes total sense, doesn't it? It was funny because she also kind of took some time to mock a passage actually from Charles Darwin about the peacock's tail. Darwin, she says, he was obsessed with this peacock's tail, and so was Geoffrey Miller. And that was with the wedding photos, actually, of his wife. He put up because she wore a peacock's tail feather, I think, in her headdress or something like that. Which is, I mean, that's a cute thing to do, but who knows? Maybe they don't like cute things. They don't like when people get married and love each other, I guess. But I don't know. So this...
I'm having deja vu. I swear I watched that bit last time.
This is not even evolutionary psychology. This is just kind of evolution more broadly. The idea of sexual selection.
I said this last time, but like I wasn't like taking the piss out of them. I was just being like, oh, that's cute. They use a peacock tail in their wedding.
Right. What is sexual selection? Darwin and the peacock's tail. What do you think?
So the peacock's tail is said to have made Charles Darwin physically sick because it didn't fit with his first big theory of natural selection, of survival of the most adapted, the kind of most fit for their environment. A peacock's tail is very costly to produce, metabolically costly, and it's like a neon light advertising yourself to predators. So it's like, why Darwin wrestled with this thought, why would selection have favoured a peacock to produce such a thing? And it led him to his second theory of sexual selection, that the female peahen just really likes the feathers. So certain traits are evolved primarily because they're favoured by the female sex. The mind of one sex shapes the body and mind of the other. It's constantly in co-evolution. So, you know, this idea of the peacock's tail once upon a time was an evolutionary puzzle to Darwin. He didn't shy away from it. He engaged with it, and it led to one of the other strongest theories he's ever produced. So, you know, there's a lesson there that evolutionary psychology shouldn't shy away from puzzles like exclusive homosexuality, things like that. We should follow in Charles Darwin's footsteps and kind of embrace the puzzle and try and figure it out.
Yeah, this kind of mockery of sexual selection, this is, of course, now...
Explain it then. Explain why peacocks have the big feathers and peahens are in that species the duller of the sexes, because that happens in most other species. The female is like the more duller one, and the male is like the one that has to impress the female. Whereas if you look at humans, women are the ones who are like wearing the big dresses and the ones that have to sort of impress generally. Throughout history, I think you'd say throughout most cultures, it's been like the men, the women who have been like I don't know, I guess the one with the bigger peacock feathers. And it's like I think all of that shows is human cultures, a lot of cultural cycles that we've been through have put more power on men than women. I think that's all that shows, and women have kind of felt pressure to wear uncomfortable outfits and to try and sort of impress men, because men have been the ones who have historically had access to all of, you know, the human resources. Because I don't know, I think evolutionary psychologists, they kind of forget how different humans are to animals in most cases, and how like those differences cause our cultures to organize in very different ways. Like animals don't even have cultures, but humans do, because they build cultures around certain things that humans have made up, i.e. money. Humans made up money. Newsflash, we made up money. You know, money is a made up thing in our heads, and our cultures throughout history have mostly been built around money. And historically, men, because women have been sort of reduced to the sort of job of getting pregnant and having children, women throughout history have been sort of reduced to having that job, whereas men throughout our historical cultures have had the privilege of having the job of accumulating this thing that we made up called money, because it is only humans who have the concept of money. It is only humans who know what money is. Like, I don't know if you've tried giving your dog or your cat a £5 note. I don't know if you've tried doing that, but if you've tried doing that, they're not very appreciative. If you try giving your dog or your cat a £5 note, they don't know what the fuck it is. Humans made up money, and throughout history, throughout thousands and thousands of years, our cultures have basically been built around this thing that we made up called money, and men have had access to that thing. Men have had direct access to that thing throughout thousands and thousands of years, and women have only had access to it through men, because women have historically been getting pregnant and giving birth. So because of that, they've sort of been reduced to this like sort of secondary thing to men throughout history. But what evolutionary psychologists think is that there's some kind of like animalistic reason as to why women have always been secondary to men. They think that there's some kind of like evolutionary, like animalistic trait to us that makes women act in a certain way that is lesser to men. And they don't consider that money is a thing that we made up, and it's been a very, very intrinsic part of our lives for thousands and thousands of years. They don't really sort of like consider that ever.
Part of the theory of evolution more broadly, we see it across animals, and she spent a lot of time kind of mocking mate preferences in general, especially at the beginning, like, oh, I like your scent or whatever. But certainly, you know, we see mate preferences across all animal species, that some individuals are preferred, some are not. Sometimes we know why, very often we do, sometimes we don't. And I mean, human beings have these mate preferences as well. We can observe them and quantify them without getting into all of what those are. It's kind of almost taking offense to the idea that people have mate preferences, that some people are more desirable than others and all of that. But I mean, this is a part of evolution, this evolution of mate preferences, and it's very, very robust in that sense. I guess some of those mate preferences, for example, something really robust in evolutionary psychology is this female desire to select mates who have traits that would make them good long-term fathers. I mean, do you think that's something that she would deny, that women want men who would be good fathers, for example, those kinds of traits?
It seems adaptive. I mean, our female ancestors who selected mates that didn't have traits for being good fathers had less fitness than the ones that selected mates with good long-term qualities. And these mate preferences, crucially, they're not arbitrary.
Let me cite another study that took part within the culture that we currently live in. Oh, what a surprise! That backs up what I'm saying. That backs up my theories about how humans evolved throughout thousands of years. It's this study that took part during this current culture that we live in. Oh, what a surprise! Ooh.
Arbitrary, right? No species makes arbitrary mate preferences, really. They're ones that over ancestral time, we inherited the preferences of our ancestors who had greater fitness. So men who selected fertile women had greater fitness than those who didn't. One cue to fertility was youth. That shows up in a very clear evolutionary prediction about what male mate preferences might be like. Absolutely, an evolutionary lens can help you make sense of what otherwise might seem arbitrary mate preferences. But I always wonder when people think about, they thumb their nose at the evolutionary view of mate preferences, I wonder, how do they make their mate preferences? How do they choose their mates? Just randomly, arbitrarily?
Yes.
What matters to them?
Yes, I point to a random guy on the street and I'm like, fuck me.
And I wager it would be the similar evolutionary things, but they would just say that it matters for a different reason.
Yeah, they would just come up kind of with their own folk psychology explanation for it in that sense. But
no, to be fair, you know how we decide these days? It's the fucking algorithm on Bumble. That's how we decide how we fuck each other these days. The Bumble or Tinder algorithm.
I mean, this research on mate preferences, what women desire in short and long-term relationships, that's early research in evolutionary psychology, some of the most robust and well-replicated research across cultures as well. I guess another thing that she was kind of mocking was kind of this evolution of cooperative behavior. What do you think of that?
Yeah, and that seems strange, as if like she suggested that, well, we're obviously a very social species. And it's like, yes, but yeah, that's why a cooperative tendency would evolve and be selected for and help us actually become the dominant species on Earth, is this sociality. And you do find that the more social other species are, the closer they are to us in line, the more social they are too. So very obvious evolutionary history of that. And that's kind of one thing of what it means to be uniquely human, is this ability to cooperate. So I don't know why the evolutionary history of cooperation, which just seems so obvious to me, I don't know why that would be even cast aspersions on.
Yeah, these are very strange things. These are almost...
Did I cast aspersions on that? I don't think I ever said that humans aren't cooperative or social. I think that's like probably the number one thing that we're evolved to do, is to be cooperative and social.
Almost kind of like the things the Manosphere mocks about evolutionary psychology, when you tell them and you say, actually, pro-social behavior is selected for. We're a very pro-social species. We have an enormous capacity for cooperation. We build very complex cooperative structures, as opposed to many animals that don't. And, you have to ask, like, why do those animals not do it? Why do we do it? Well, obviously, we're a different species. We've evolved differently. Mm-hmm. That our behavior has evolved in that sense as well.
And just wait, one more point on the mate preferences as well. It's an area of sexual psychology where we see fairly large sex differences. Yes. Both sexes like kindness and intelligence in a partner, but there are some key differences. And guess where you find those differences? Where each sex face different selection pressures in their ancestral environment. Men face the adaptive pressure of choosing fertile mates. Women's fertility declines more sharply than men's. So it's a sex-differentiated selection pressure. Therefore, in response to that selection pressure, our ancestors who preferred fertile mates used youth as a cue to that fertility. They're the preferences we inherited. Yeah. On the other hand, women...
No, I don't agree. Like, it's these guys, they really think that everything is so much deeper than it really is. The only thing that we have evidence for is like how genes want to be passed on, and genes clearly want to be passed on in a way that makes them as varied as possible, because that is what makes species as robust as possible, is when they are varied. So us fucking randomly, literally us going up to people randomly and fucking them, is the best thing for our species. Completely random, because that makes us robust as a species. They think about these things so much more deeply than they need to be thought about. Like, women are not looking at men and being like, oh, how good are you gonna be as a partner, as a father? Like, we're literally not thinking of it like that. Like, maybe on a higher sort of like cultural level we are, because like in the culture that we're currently living in, it is sort of expected of you to, if you got pregnant, to know who the father is of your baby and to expect them to be a responsible father figure in some way. But that is literally just a very current cultural expectation. We could be living in an entirely different culture. Oh, thank you for the cheer. Can I get a fuck off, please? It's not 10,000 bits though, bro. It's not 10,000. It's only 500. Fuck off. There you go. But no, what was I talking about? Yeah, these guys, they think it's so deep. They think it's so specific, the way in which we choose mates and the ways in which we act within relationships. It's not that deep. It's not that specific. We're just, literally all we're trying to do is fuck each other randomly. That's all our genes are trying to do. Like, our genes are literally saying, please fuck someone with the most different genes to me. But like, they're not technically saying that, but they're just saying, fuck someone with different genes, please. So my genes can very, very randomly shuffle like a deck of cards. What your genes want to do is like fan like a deck of cards and like integrate with another person's genes. But that doesn't even mean that your genes are going to be like, 50% your visible traits with 50% their visible traits. Because what it could end up with is like some genes that never expressed in you and some genes that never expressed in them could literally come together and express in the child. And it could be completely down to whatever environment that child was brought up in that made those genes express. It's so random. Genetics is so random. And that's just something that they never want to talk about, is how fucking random the whole thing is. Like, what they want to do is impose order on everything that happens when there isn't really much order. It does remind me of like the way that like very religious people want to see things. Like it does remind me of like creationism, but a very sort of scientific version of creationism. It reminds me of sort of like people who want to believe that there is some sort of order going on in the world, like, and they want to believe that there's some sort of explanation for all of the noise that goes on in the world, when there honestly isn't much explanation for it. It's all just noise. I feel like evolutionary psychologists, they really want to give explanations to noise when those explanations aren't there. What the explanation really is, rather than scientific explanations, is cultures that we're currently in. Because as humans, what we're evolved to do is we're evolved to be very social, and within that very wired instinct to be social, what we do is we create cultures. Evolutionary psychology researchers, what they tend to do is they look at the current culture, whatever is going on right now, and they will build studies based on it. And they will build studies as a person who is sort of wired into that very current culture that we're in right now. But what they're unable to do is unwire themselves from that and be able to like completely disconnect themselves from that. So what they can't see is the bigger genetic picture. And they don't realize that what humans are actually evolved to do is they're evolved to wire themselves into the cultures that they are born into. Because what we're actually evolved to do is to be very social with each other and to make plans. Because when humans first evolved, I believe that the reason that we thrived as a species is because we could make plans with each other through the use of language, because we're the only species that evolved language. And we evolved to make plans with each other, to, enact hunts, like to do hunts and stuff like that. We hunted in groups, and we did that through making plans with each other. Whereas other species, what they would do is they wouldn't use language to plan hunts. Like other species would just use instinct, and they wouldn't need to plan with each other. They just used instinct to be able to hunt in packs. Whereas what humans did is they separated each other. They separated themselves from other animals by being able to tell each other what the plan was for the hunt. And that is what differentiates us from other animals. This is why the pet buttons piss me off, because I know that the animals do not have a clue. Animals have no concept of language. They just have instincts. But humans are so wired into the culture that they're in, and they're so wired into language and concepts, that they cannot even fathom the fact that animals are not wired in the same way. They can't even fathom that. They're like, oh yeah, animals, they must be able to understand language. So they must be able to understand it when they're pressing this random button that says this random word that I understand. So surely they must be able to understand it if I just teach them how to, because clearly I'm more evolved than this animal here. I'm just more intelligent than them. That's why I understand what this button language means. And if I just teach them, then they'll be able to understand it as well, because I'm just more clever than them. And it's actually a really narcissistic way of looking at humans and animals. It's kind of narcissistic because you're kind of just saying, basically, I'm more evolved than animals, which is not true. All animals are evolved to the most evolved status that they can be. It's just that humans evolved in a different way alongside animals, and humans evolved language differently to what animals evolved, whatever the species is. And the way that some humans think that they can teach animals language just kind of says to me, this is why it triggers me, because it kind of says to me that that person thinks that they're more evolved than that animal. And they think that if they just teach that animal how to talk, then they would be as evolved as the human. It's not true. We are animals. We absolutely are. But we're just evolved in a different way. We're not more evolved. we are as evolved. I think like the problem comes like when we think that we're at the top of the food chain, when we think that we're the most evolved. Anyway, I went off on a tangent then.
Women preferred higher status mates who could provision her and her offspring with resources. They preferred taller mates who could keep them safe from the hostile forces of nature. That so many predictions.
Yeah. Watch the Soup Emporium video about Coco the gorilla. Soup Emporium. Coco the gorilla. Excellent video that explains why Coco could not speak English and why we thought that Coco could speak English. It was all down to our cognitive bias and the way that we view animals.
Predictions and facts of mate preferences can be explained by these different selection pressures.
Mm-hmm. And this is a sexual strategies theory. What you're explaining here, or part of it at least, the idea that when pressures are similar, when we face similar challenges, men and women, then we see smaller sex differences. When the pressures are different, that's when we see larger sex differences there. And that's the theoretical background for this, and the hypotheses to test that. Like, do we see, a difference in a preference for earning or income potential or education? That's where we see these large sex differences that's consistent with that. So kind of validating that theory.
Absolutely, yeah.
So let's see. Yeah, there's room for kind of critiques of these hypotheses and all of this.
Yeah, there's implications for AI in all of this as well, because in much the same way that we thought Coco the gorilla could talk to us, there are very much the same psychological processes going on when we think that large language models know how to talk to us. But in a different way, because large language models are actually programmed to talk to us in a way that we think that they can talk to us. But they're absolutely not talking to us in the way that another human being would talk to us.
But in critiquing some of these, specific things, this nut picking, she swept up some pretty basic, tenets, key features, not just of evolutionary psychology, but of evolution broadly.
Yeah, and there was a kind of a weird, even when she brought up Charles Darwin, she was kind of like, who I would consider maybe one of the greatest scientists of all time, like what a contribution to life, intellectual life, and our understanding of who we are in the universe, how we got here, what it means to be human. And she's kind of like lampooning him, introducing him as this old white grandpa type thing. And I don't know, is this just kind of in vogue to... No, he was just, he was right about a lot of things, but he was also working within his time. He was pretty racist. He thought that white people were more evolved than black people. There was just problems with what he did, but I wasn't saying that he was wrong about everything. He was just of his time. Criticize old white men, so Charles Darwin is one. I don't know, yeah.
That nut, Charles Darwin, evolution.
Crazy.
Who knows, we're creationists now, so... Kind of what we mentioned in some past slides, she seems to make a lot of the same errors as the Manosphere as far as thinking about these things. Kind of maybe thinking non-replication is bad or something like that. About status hierarchy, I think she said status hierarchy is fixed at one point. What is your thoughts on that?
Yeah, at the very outset of the video, she seemed to kind of link that conservatives would use evolutionary psychology as a defending of their worldview. And one naturalistic fallacy that she committed was suggesting that evolutionary psychology contends that status hierarchies are fixed and that there is nothing you can do to change your position in that hierarchy. She thinks that that's the position of the conservatives and that that's the position of the evolutionary psychologists. But it's precisely the opposite. We always talk about status hierarchies as being constantly traversed, and we look at the things you can do to traverse those hierarchies and what contributes to it. It's actually almost a very incel-like black pill thinking of, evolutionary psychology thinks you're fixed. Precisely the opposite. Even something like mate value, we always talk about how you can increase your mate value or it can decrease.
So, he's basically saying you can increase your mate value, but what he's essentially saying is, genetically, your mate value is fixed, but you can change it if you, I don't know, do things to change it, try and become an alpha male to increase your mate value, to become... to elevate from a 5 to a 10. My point is this obsession with a hierarchy in the first place. In the whole sort of concept behind the hierarchy in the Manosphere is, you could be a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, or 10. And the whole sort of idea in the Manosphere is that there is this universal number of attractiveness that you can apply to yourself. And, you know, every woman or every man who might ever look at you as a potential mate will see you as that same number. Oh, you're definitely a 7 or you're definitely a 6. And, you know, no one has their own types. No one has their own preferences. No, there's always this number, and you're always going to be reduced to this number in any way. Like, that's what the Manosphere says, but that's really not how things happen in real life. That is how things happen on dating apps a lot of the time, but not in real life. Where, like, when people get to actually know each other and they've not been served each other via an algorithm and made judgments of each other based on a few messages, a few DMs, or a few sentences that were written on their dating profiles or whatever. Generally, in real life, what we do like to do is fuck each other randomly. Completely randomly. You know, like how our genetics want us to do. They want us to fuck each other randomly. But dating apps, they don't follow sort of like what we've always done historically as humans. Like they have hierarchized. Is that a word? Hierarchized? They have hierarchized humans, dating apps, and that's not real life. That's generally not how things have ever happened. But a lot of evolutionary psychologists are like, oh, dating apps, they've just exposed how we really see each other as humans. They've just exposed how the real mechanics work of mating. No, they've just sort of like made us see each other in very reductive ways that aren't very human at all.
We never look at something as totally fixed, and this idea of the naturalistic fallacy that evolutionary psychology describing human nature make the contention that, well, that's the way we should be. There's tons of examples of how we necessarily override our evolved nature all the time. You get road rage in the car, you shouldn't act on it, right? It's not right that you get road rage. You should try and quell that down. We do that all the time. So the only way to override
Hierarchical, is that the word I'm looking for?
your
What was I saying again?
negative tendencies is to understand them by investigating them. Denying that they're there, or their evolutionary roots, is really harmful because it just kind of hamstrings you and you can't actually overcome anything then. You're kind of stuck. You're tramlined.
Yeah, that's interesting, kind of that overriding bit. I think a lot of discourse on jealousy is like that, where if people feel jealousy, they think this is incredibly toxic and it needs to be overridden, and they'll be like, go work on yourself. And it's like, but jealousy also probably has some important roots, and it's not always the case that it's necessarily a bad thing. Being aware of jealousy and what induces it and when it is bad and when it is kind of good, and, you know, having an accurate mental map of the
Hierarchized. Is that what I was saying?
world helps you kind of make sense of the world and your own feelings and all of that. If you don't have that accurate mental map, then you're confused by yourself in that sense.
Yeah, even some feelings like depression and anxiety. There's great work in evolutionary medicine and evolutionary psychiatry now, the adaptive roots of depression and anxiety. There's a really good book by Randolph Nesse called Good Reasons for Bad Feelings, that it talks about how these feelings evolved over time and why they persist with us, what they were for, what the function was, and why they maybe are misfiring in the modern world where they're maybe not as appropriate. This idea of evolutionary mismatch, where the world that we see around us is radically different from...
Hey, this beer is not 12%. This beer is 0%. This beer is Sainsbury's Diet Lemonade. So...
the environment in response to which our psychology evolved. And understanding the ways in which it is very different can be very informative about some kind of maladaptive uses of our psychology.
Yeah, that's a good point, because now we're moving away from mating preferences to other things like emotions. So a lot of the time when people criticize evolutionary psychology or this or that, they're very kind of embroiled in kind of like this gender discourse where it's like, I hate women, I hate men, man bad, no, woman bad. And they go back and forth like that. But evolutionary psychology touches on many things, such as the evolution of emotions. Why did we evolve to feel this in contexts that have nothing to do with like mate selection or anything like that? Don't see that she mentioned any of that in this video. I don't know to what extent she would be familiar.
I swear these guys did not watch the entire last part of my video, because it's the entire last part of my video is about feelings and emotions.
With that, or even be able to critique it. But I mean, everything that you feel has evolved for a reason in that sense.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, but that's the thing is she zeroed in on some topics. I think she guessed she could lampoon, but ignored a lot of other things.
I guess like the reason that these guys like they seem to not be able to clock what I'm saying is because it's so far removed from what they've spent their entire life, from the theories that they've spent their entire working life working towards and working within. My theories are so far removed from that. They're not even working within the same theoretical framework. And I think that's why they're sort of either forgetting them or not even registering them. But my theories are entirely different. But they're also backed up by scientists. And like I can advocate like Adam Rutherford, the guy that I cited a lot in my video because I agree with a lot of what he said. He sent me a DM and he was like, that video was fantastic. It was fabulous. You know, he was very happy with what I said, which goes to show that actual genetic scientists who are working actively in the field of genetics right now back up what I was saying in that video. But it's so far removed from what they've been studying for decades. Like the part of my video, there's a chapter in the video called Evolutionary Psychologists Don't Know How Genes Work. And it starts out with George Bush making a speech that happened about 20 years ago, where he was basically saying we're gonna map out the entire human genome, and once we've done that, we're gonna be able to cure every fucking cancer ever. Like that's what George Bush was saying in front of everyone, and that was like 20 years ago, and that's how we thought genes worked at the time. Since then, we've learned that genes don't work like that because they're far more complex. You know, the reason why they're so much more complex than that is because they want to shuffle up as much as possible and create as much variance as possible. And when that comes to things like curing cancer, for example, that's not beneficial for us, because what we want to be able to do is find the cause of cancer genetically and be able to nip it in the bud. As soon as someone's born and they've got the genes that mean that they're predisposed to cancer, what we want to be able to do is remove that gene straight away so that they never get cancer. And that's what George Bush was saying that we were going to be able to do. Did that happen? Did that ever happen? No. But evolutionary psychologists are still working under that framework because they still believe that genes work in that very simple way. We've since learnt that genes do not work in that very simple way. And people like William Costello on the left here, he's working under David Buss. David Buss has been working in this field for decades and decades and decades. And he's been working in the field ever since we believed that genes worked in that way, in that very simple way in which we could just literally, like, there weren't that many genes. We used to think that there weren't that many genes and we could just literally breed out whatever we wanted to breed out quite easily. And he was working under the assumption that because there were so many less genes than we eventually realized there were, that led to the sort of assumption that, well, you know, the ways that people act, that must be for a very good reason, because there were probably reasons why people were fucking certain other people. It means that for decades, for hundreds of years, certain genes must have been fucked out of us, right? That's what the assumption was, because we thought that genes worked in a very simple way back then. But then 20 years ago, we started mapping out the human genome, and since then, we realised that we have far more shit going on than we thought we did. Far more shit. Like some diseases you can breed out, such as sickle cell disease. Sickle cell disease is a disease that is connected to a specific gene, one gene, which you can breed out of humans because it's connected to one gene. So you can breed out things like sickle cell disease because it's very clearly connected to one gene. But most traits and most diseases and most cancers, they are connected to a multitude of genes, like clusters of genes that are spread out in the human genome, like throughout the entire thing, in such sporadic ways that scientifically you are never going to know which ones are like causing the affliction to happen. Yeah, David Buss, who William Costello is working under, David Buss has been working in the field for so long that he's working under the assumption that genes still work in the way that we thought that they did before we mapped out the human genome. Like, when we mapped out the human genome, it fucked everything up that we thought we knew scientifically about genes. It fucked everything up. But they're still working under that old framework because they refuse to accept that anything else could be possible. Because they have this whole framework built up now. They just think that genetically we must have been caused to act in certain ways because genes are quite simple actually, and we've probably only got 20,000 of them. When in reality we've got way more than that probably. We don't even know. We don't even fucking know how many fucking genes we have. Way more than that, and we have no idea how those genes are affecting how even our very visual traits are affected. Never mind our psychological ones. We have no idea. But what we have the most evidence for is variance. Our genes, like, we have traits and our genes want to create variance within those traits. Those traits involve things like sexuality and, even things like, whatever gives people schizophrenia or autism or whatever. It's always a trait where there's a spectrum and you're either on the extreme end of it or in the middle or on the other extreme. And that's also very much affected by your environment as well. That's what we know. That's all we know. But these guys, they don't want to kind of accept this new theory that's coming out.
That evolutionary psychology has to say about you.
Yeah, she ignored an enormous amount of that. Some of these very well replicated things are totally unrelated to mating preferences. We'll mention that in another slide as well. A quote that I wrote this down, it was a quote, she said, evolutionary, this was in reference to the non-replications of the ovulatory shift hypothesis and going on to the mate switching hypothesis, like you described. She said, evolutionary psychology is going back on its original hypothesis when new evidence comes to light. Like, this is supposed to be a bad thing, that it's going back on the hypothesis. So something the Manosphere notoriously does with this dual mating hypothesis, like that's become kind of like you said, a bastardization of it, has become kind of like this fixture for alphas and betas. They've twisted into this weird thing. But that's the scientific method right there. The idea that, okay, you have a hypothesis, you test it. If the hypothesis is not confirmed in your test, if you're not able to replicate it, you move on. It's not a bad thing to do that, to go back against your original hypothesis. You're supposed to kind of maybe discard that and rethink things if it comes out. This is, the way that a lot of people think, though, it's not well informed, I guess, by the scientific method. This idea that you can never be wrong, you can never change your mind or anything. Scientists should be open to being wrong and changing them.
That's like literally what I'm saying. That's what I'm explaining in the video. I'm explaining how genetically we'd got things wrong for a very long time, and now we know how genes work. And isn't your entire scientific field built around how genes affect brains? And I'm explaining how scientifically we've rediscovered how genes work. And the thing that I'm criticizing you for is for continuing to work within your previous genetic framework when we have a new genetic framework that came out. That's what I'm criticizing you for. But that's what I'm saying. They don't want to accept the new genetic framework that is like the new scientific consensus. They're still working within the old one.
Their mind and testing things that they think, okay, that could be right, it could be wrong, I don't really know. But being very comfortable with saying that was wrong, discard it, go on to the next thing there.
Yeah, that's the scientific method. You correct for yourself, yeah, for sure.
Let's see. Let's go on now and see what else we're looking at. So, as we mentioned, some of this ovulatory shift research, this was probably what she talked about as far as like actual research. This is probably what she spent most of the time on. If she researched this making her video, I'd be surprised if she didn't come across my own articles on it, because they come up at the top of search results. This ovulatory shift hypothesis, the idea that across the woman's cycle, she has a shift in mating preferences, right? So a preference for more masculine faces, for example, when a woman is ovulating. A lot of this research, of course, has not replicated. I've made videos on this and written articles about it. I've kind of rung this bell that hasn't replicated quite extensively myself. And I guess there's a question here. When she asks, like, this has not replicated, who are the people that are running these replications and not replicating? Who are they?
Also evolutionary psychologists.
They're also evolutionary psychologists. It's not like blank slatists coming from some other paradigm that are running these replications. It's evolutionary psychologists with other hypotheses, and they're saying, okay, maybe these shifts aren't real, or maybe they're very small.
It's not only other evolutionary psychologists, it's also just in general psychologists, because psychology in general has had a replication crisis. It's also not just psychology that's had a replication crisis, it's science as a whole has had a replication crisis. So yeah, some of these guys who had realized that there's a replication crisis, yeah, some of them are evolutionary psychologists. My problem is that when they realize that they've made a mistake, hello Raiders, my problem is when they've realized that they've made a mistake is they're working within the same genetic predisposed assumptions as what they have been doing for decades and decades and decades, when they're not working within what the new genetic framework, they're not working within the framework of the new genetic knowledge that we have nowadays. They don't consider genes. They still want to work within their own framework. Their base assumptions still are, well, we must have genetically selected for this for some reason.
No just Corbyn, no just Green, no Justice Raid.
That's...
No just Green, no just Sarkar, no just Corbyn, no just Green.
So that's still the framework that they're working under, is this assumption that genes, there must be genes that are making us mate in a specific way. That is still the assumption that they are working under. They will not consider variance. They will not consider that genes are there to create variance. All they will consider is that genes are there to make women act a certain way and to make men act a certain way, because evolution, and because genes must be making us act in certain ways to make us mate in certain ways to make certain genes make it to the next generation. That is the framework that they work under, and they won't break out of that when new science comes along and says, actually, this is not how genes work. That is my problem with their entire field. It's great that they're considering that their own studies didn't replicate. That's great, but when they don't replicate, you have to consider why. And what you have to do is, when your own studies don't replicate, you have to consider why. And to look at why, you have to consider other fields of research. You have to look at other people's fields of research, i.e. geneticists, because your field of research is very closely related to geneticists. And if you're not even considering what they're saying, then you're not progressing knowledge scientifically. You're just still going along with your previous theories, and you're working backwards from it. If you're not considering what other scientific fields are saying,
small or conditional, but it's only evolutionary psychologists testing this and running these replications.
Yeah, and the theoretical framework for the ovulatory shift makes a lot of sense. We see a lot of chimps have something similar, where when the female is in estrus, that's when you see sexual behaviour. The male chimps would largely ignore the female when she's not ovulating. So it's reasonable to suggest there be some relic of this in humans, and when you go looking for evidence, if you don't find the evidence and it doesn't support your hypothesis, you move on. That's normal science.
Exactly, yeah. And in some of these replications, there's evidence like, okay, so shifts toward facial masculinity, maybe not. Some other things like higher libido, that's extremely well replicated.
Yeah.
That women experience higher libido when
yeah, I accept that in the video. when women ovulate, when women are ovulating, they have a higher libido. I accepted that in the video and I accept that now. That has been replicated. We are more horny when we are in the ovulatory stage of the cycle. So yeah, guys, if you want to get your girls at the exact time, well, what you're going to have to do is somehow hack into her period tracking app and find the days where she's ovulating. You're going to have to hack into her Apple Health app, find the days that she's ovulating, and come on to her during those few days. That is scientifically backed evidence. Anything else is bullshit.
They're ovulating. So we know that ovulation has some effects on human psychology. That's not something that doesn't replicate. That's very, very robust. So it's some of these specific shifts in mate preferences. And what's interesting is like, these are not that crucial, like to your worldview. Like, does it really matter if women like men a little bit more, who are a little bit more facially masculine when they're ovulating? Yeah. It's weird that that's become kind of a fixture of the manosphere as well, because it's not.
But it's not true. It's just absolutely not true. Like the whole concept of more manly is cultural. The whole concept of angular jaw, whatever, cultural. You've made it up, bro. In the same way that we made up money, we made up the concept of a guy that looks more masculine than another guy. We made it up. I'm sorry. It's not real.
That important of a finding.
Yeah, which is the morally suspect hypothesis, the mate switching or the dual mating? I don't know.
Yeah, it's funny too, because in the Manosphere, they're like, they want to suppress this because they can't let it get out. That's why it's not replicating. And it's like, it's not that controversial. It's not that big a deal.
They only knew how science works and how we're not that coordinated to run a conspiracy like that, for sure.
Yeah, and so if she doesn't propose alternative explanations, but like, what would the blank slate explanation be for the rise of libido when a woman is ovulating?
Are they saying I'm a blank slatist? Because I never said that. And also I said in the video, the only thing we have evidence for is a fucking rise in libido when women ovulate. I fucking said that in the video. Ah!
Like, why would hormones shift human behavior and human psychology in certain ways?
I don't know what a hypothesis might be, but it would have to be a just so story, because it would be just making up something out of the blue. These predictions or these theories about why that might be the case, you can make arguments based on a theoretical evolutionary framework that you may or may not find data for. Normal science, I don't know what the theoretical framework would be for that.
I have not even heard like an alternative explanation for like an increase in libido during ovulation. Some things they can attribute, to like, it's patriarchy. They learned it. You did not learn to be horny when you're ovulating.
Yes.
That's not a part of it. Makes sense.
Here's another one. Women are far greater in sexual disgust than men. And that's for a good evolutionary reason. They're far more at risk of STDs, have a lot more to lose from sex in general. So, yes, as we...
Culture, that applies culturally as well. Women have more to lose in every sense of the word. In everything, women have more to lose in these situations.
We would predict they have an evolved psychology.
You know why? Because of another thing that we made up called money.
For greater sexual disgust. Try explaining that by patriarchy. When are women taught to be more sexually disgusted? Or actually, when are they taught to actually be more at risk of STDs in their biology? So, is that...
What? We're taught that culturally. We're like, literally, women are taught to be more demure, to be more mindful, to be more demure. We're literally taught that culturally.
Patriarchy? Or evolution is very patriarchal, I guess.
It's a very patriarchal force of nature. There's a lot in evolutionary psychology that does not lend itself well to patriarchy, which we can talk about this in another slide. It's also kind of a just so story in itself in many ways. But she mentions this as well, and I think this is kind of another maybe failure to understand psychology and science in general and research. She talks about these old studies, and she says, look, these are old studies. Look how old this PDF is, as if something is old. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, in psychology, we're kind of taught if there's a seminal theoretical contribution, you cite the theoretical first seminal paper. And some of these old papers are replicated. They're very robust, first of all, and they're replicated time and time again. So The mate preferences studies that David Buss did in 1989, first of all, extremely non-weird. 37 different cultures, thousands of participants from all over the world, finding a large degree of universality in mate preferences.
Yeah, that's the thing though with his sex preferences study. You're still doing this within many cultures who, like, literally every culture is a patriarchal culture. You're not going to have like 50% of them to be a matriarchal culture, are you? Like, consider the way in which the world operates right now. You're not going to find 50% matriarchal cultures and 50% patriarchal cultures, are you? Really? Like, not in 1989 and not now. Never.
Recently replicated with an even larger cross-cultural sample by Katie Walter in 2020. And, what best practice, I think, in my citation is to cite the original and then cite the most up-to-date evidence. But some of these findings, like, for example, the sex differences in desire for sexual variety, they've been replicated so many times that it would be almost impossible to cite them all. You'd have pages upon pages. My supervisor, David Buss, he calls them the most boring replications in all of psychology. We find them, again, by accident when we're looking for other things.
Yes, because it's extremely cultural. It's like literally one of the most ingrained things in human culture you could possibly ever come across is the idea that men are supposedly more likely to be like, yes, I would like to have sex with lots of different women in my life. And for women to be like, oh, I'd like to settle down with a man. That is the cultural norm in most cities, in most cultures in the entire world. It is the norm. It's not a surprise.
Citing something old and seminal isn't an indictment on its quality. It may be that the theories have moved on, but in the case of mate preferences, it hasn't really. We find it replicated time and time again.
Yeah, in that paper specifically by David Buss in 1989, this has been cited about 6,000 times. To give an example, the papers that Kahneman and Tversky won the Nobel Prize for was cited about 50,000 times. The average number of citations a researcher gets, like, across all of his papers is like 180. So this is you see papers like this that are old, they've been cited thousands of times. That's because they're holding up. They're still good. They're still so influential that people continue to cite them. It's not the case that because a study's old, you don't want to cite it. That is occasionally taught to undergraduates, though. Like don't find the old studies. Try to find something new. But these are old studies that are getting replicated. It's not the case that it's just like you can dismiss it because it's old. That's the question, is like, did it hold up to the test of time or not? Some old things do, and they do very well in that sense. Another old study here, we'll go on kind of to the next one. Clark and Hatfield initially. I think this was also originally done in 1989. What is the Clark and Hatfield research line?
So this can be described as a would you have sex with a stranger study, where they ask university students at first, would you have sex with...
Yeah, it's similarly from 1989. Yeah, I think this is the one that I talked about in the video, I think, where the song that literally directly quotes it is like, I've been noticing you around. Do, 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 do. I found you very attractive. Do, 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 do. Would you have sex with me? That actually came from this study where they told men and women to, like, walk up to people of the other gender and say that, and they recorded the results. Absolute banger.
To the stranger, and you find that I think like 70% of men said yes immediately and 0% of women said that they would. And this illustrates the kind of the different sex
Would you go to bed with me?
psychologies in desire for sexual variety and for immediate access to sex. Other data points that kind of point to the same thing is the number of sex partners men and women report to want over the lifetime, how quickly men and women agree to want sex, how easily they'll have sex without love. There's lots of converging lines of evidence of men's greater readiness for sex. And I'd point to two papers. One academic paper written by David Buss and David Schmidt in 2011, and it was about whether evolutionary psychologists could ever be feminist. And it was published in the journal Sex Roles, which is kind of a feminist journal, and it talks about this large degree of sex differences. And they've got one table, chock-a-block full of evidence. It's just so powerful. Alternatively, maybe for free access for any listeners who don't have an academic email or something like that, a Psychology Today article by David Schmidt, kind of relaying these findings to lay audience, talking about would you have sex with a stranger. One fundamental flaw in the way...
It's just the most unsurprising study result ever. Like, either in 1989, in which gender norms were even more extreme than they are now, is like to have a person come up to a person of the other gender and be like, do you want to have sex with me? It's the most unsurprising result ever to have more men say yes than women. It's the least surprising thing ever. Simply for the... Oh, thank you for the 1,000 bits. The song was by David Lowe. I know, the same musician who did the BBC News themes. I know. I said that. If you watch the live stream that I did on my main YouTube channel, after that, I explained how I realised that, and I was very excited about it. But yeah, it was by David Lowe, that song. The same guy who made the BBC News theme. Coincidences everywhere. But yeah, that 1989 study where they told people just to come up to people in public and be like, do you want to go to bed with me? The least surprising result is that more men said yes than women. It's the least surprising result ever. And it's not because men want more sexual variety than women. It's quite simply because women have more things to worry about. Like, i.e. STDs, pregnancy, being fucking murdered. Because, like, literally, as a woman, the first thing that you would think, if a man came up to you in the fucking park and said, do you want to have sex with me? The literal first thing that your brain would go to is, I am going to get murdered if I say yes. That is literally the first thing that your brain would go to. It's such an obvious result. But like these are guys. They don't know what the fuck they're talking about. They don't fucking know what it's like to be a woman.
When Mooncat kind of represented this research, she kind of suggested that this is all because of women's greater fear of violence and pregnancy. Unintentionally, perhaps, she's actually pointed to the evolutionary rationale for why there would be such a sex difference at all, where we would predict that women would have a reluctance to sex with a stranger. But in those studies, they actually...
How is that evolutionary?
They followed on with studies, the same authors, Clark and Hatfield, followed on with studies controlling for stigma, controlling for sexual pleasure, controlling for pregnancy, controlling for reputational damage, controlling for everything you can imagine. And it's still men way more inclined to have sex with a stranger. It's a massively robust finding.
How the fuck are you controlling for that, William? Bill? Billy, how are you controlling for... Please let me know the statistical model that allowed you to control for all of those things within the culture that we're living in. Please fucking let me know.
And it's kind of disingenuous, or perhaps you didn't know that they actually did control for those things in later studies. But yeah, it's absolutely not just a difference of, oh, well, women are in greater fear. Well, first of all, they're in greater fear for an evolutionary reason, but yeah.
Yeah, so even controlling for all of these other things that could be sort of a standard social science model explanations for that, the sex difference still persists. And I think, even if you just ask men and women, like, do you want to do this, all things being equal? That's kind of the responses that you're going to get. And I know she mentioned, like, she doesn't necessarily believe survey data, which is also kind of a parallel to the Manosphere. A lot of people seem to question this. They seem to say, ask women, you should just ask women what they want. A lot of this is doing that, and women will just tell you, and it's not that unintuitive or controversial that women do not want to have sex with strangers and men kind of do.
Yeah, but there's survey data, there's behavioral data. Men buy sex more often, they have more affairs. There's so much triangulated data on this one phenomenon that it's remarkable that survey data could be dismissed. You could lose all the survey data and still come to this conclusion.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, because the Clark and Hatfield research is not survey data. They sent experimenters to school campuses to approach people and ask them. So
The fucking student survey. I hate that they treat this like so scientifically. Also, like with any survey, the bias of the researcher always finds its way into the results. Whatever you're doing, the bias of the researcher always makes its way in, because you can write questions in certain ways that invite certain answers, even if you don't realize you're doing it as a researcher. And when that ties in with like cultural expectations of people, that like you can almost guarantee that you're going to get a specific answer back. You can just almost guarantee it.
So they're saying, what do people actually do? Well, that's what you see. That's what they actually do. The sex difference in this was remarkably large, as particularly in the original few Clark and Hatfield ones. I think it was a Cohen's D of like 3, where you get like almost all of the men saying, yeah, I'll do it, I'll go home with you, and like 0% of the women. It was really quite remarkable there. So yeah, kind of like you said, she kind of unintentionally gave the evolutionary explanation for that.
It's really quite remarkable that 0% of the women in this study wanted to get murdered.
Why are women not likely to have sex with a stranger? Fear of violence, fear of pregnancy. I mean, pregnancy is an evolved function. She's giving the evolutionary explanation for it. It's like, why are women afraid of pregnancy? Because they can get pregnant.
Yeah, but importantly, this...
Oh my god! He's questioning why women are afraid of getting pregnant in this economy!
This kind of talks about that, or it points to that evolutionary mismatch, that even controlling for those things in the current environment, because of our ancestral environment of this being a strong selection pressure, women will retain the psychology of being reluctant. You can't just say, take for example men's greater sexual jealousy too. You could be given assurances to any man, oh don't worry, your partner had sex with another man, but they use protection, your paternal certainty is totally shored up, don't worry. They're still not going to be going for that. They'll still hate that. That will be visceral response of jealousy. So yeah, the past explains the present, where our mind evolved to these selection pressures, and that's how we operate.
Exactly, yeah. And that's an important thing, is that a lot of these psychological processes and dispositions are not necessarily conscious in that sense. So it's not necessarily the woman is thinking like, oh, I might get pregnant, and then all of a sudden she's on birth control, and now she's saying, oh, I'm just going to have sex with strangers because I'm on birth control, I can't get pregnant. That persists. So it's not necessarily a conscious thought, is it?
Yeah, and you will have a small effect of the proximate, oh, I'm on birth control, I'm actually free to have more casual sex, and you probably will find a small effect, but yeah, we're largely there. You'll never completely diminish that sex difference. It's such a fundamental, large biological difference between men and women. The psychological difference in correspondence to that will be large too.
And sex differences.
And it's absolutely impossible that they could have been taught that culturally. That could never happen. No.
And jealousy, that's another finding that has been very well replicated. Kind of emotional infidelity, sexual infidelity. Can you tell us a bit about that?
So again, the best way to describe this is with a kind of a rhyme of mama's baby, papa's maybe. So throughout ancestral history, ancestral men could never be sure that their offspring was really theirs.
Again, this hypothesis was written under the assumption that genes want to be passed on to the next generation. Remember that. What we've recently learned within the past couple of decades is that hypothesis of the gene itself wanting to be passed on to the next generation is quite likely not true, because genes are far more complex than that. So consider that they've written this hypothesis entirely under the assumption that the gene itself wants to be passed on to the next generation.
Ancestral men could never be sure that their offspring was really theirs. Every woman who has a child knows for sure that offspring is theirs. It's coming out of their body. It can't be anybody else's. But men could never be sure. The only way they could be sure was to vigilantly guard their mate and be extremely jealous, to pick up on cues that she may be mating with someone else. And, you know, that...
There is also other evidence that when we used to live in tribes, what was actually most important to us was that the babies survived, and it didn't fucking matter who brought them up. It was just like the village brought up the kid. It didn't matter who the actual mother was or who the actual father was. Didn't matter. As long as the kid got fucking brought up, didn't fucking matter.
That is a
It's just our current cultures that have decided that the biological mother and the biological father should be the primary caregivers. That's my argument, is that it's just our current culture that expects that of us. But we have previously thrived in communities where it didn't really matter who brought up the little wee children, the little wee shits.
sex-differentiated selection pressure. Women, on the other hand, needed to be more attuned to emotional infidelity because that is more of a greater cue to misdirecting resources towards someone else and their offspring. Now, women don't like sexual infidelity either because it's often a cue to emotional infidelity too, but men are actually capable of having a lot of infidelity that isn't actually emotional in nature. Doesn't tend to be typical for women. Of course, some will be able to have those type of affairs, but typically women's sexual infidelity follows an emotional infidelity too.
Yeah, that's perhaps one of the more black-pilling, so to speak, features of male infidelity is that men might cheat more, even if the relationship is kind of good, even if they have high relationship satisfaction. And certainly so, another thing you mentioned there, as far as behavioral data, yeah, you see it in who visits sex workers, who signs up to Ashley Madison or something like that.
Yes.
You know, it's typically men in that case. So it's not...
Hey, we got some raiders from Hannah Reloaded. Guys, we're discussing the evolutionary reasoning for orgasmic upsucking.
Nulliparity refers to women who are kind of sexually viable but have not been pregnant yet. And that would have been very important. So ancestral men had not only a preference for youth, but a preference for nulliparity too. Because I've been reading lately, actually being a woman's first sexual partner was very, very important in the ancestral environment. Because in the ancestral environment, without birth control and without modern medicine, women, once they started having sex, were often pregnant or lactating. So there wasn't much time after that first sexual access to...
I'm sorry. I've been distracted by chat. What's he going on about now? What's Two Watchman going on about now?
Actually being a woman's first sexual partner was very, very important.
What? I want to know what the evolutionary reasoning was behind this goatee, though, to be honest. Look at him stroking it. And also, what's the evolutionary reasoning behind both of his watches? Why does he need two watches? Like, nowadays, like, this looks like an Apple Watch, right? These can be integrated. These things can tell both the time and and your fitness shit if you really... So there is absolutely no reason for you to have another watch on in addition to an Apple is that what they call iWatch?
For youth.
An Apple Watch.
But a preference for nulliparity too. Because I've been reading lately, actually being a woman's first sexual partner was very, very important in the ancestral environment because in the ancestral...
I don't think they gave a shit in the ancestral environment. I don't think they gave a shit who... Pardon me. I don't think they gave a shit who was a virgin in the ancestral environment. I'm sorry. I don't think they gave a flying fuck who was a virgin. I don't think they understood the concept of a virgin in the ancestral environment.
That birth control and where...
Honestly, I think that whole concept of virginity came around the same time when we started controlling women. I think that's when that started coming about as a concept, but that's my theory.
Without modern medicine, women, once they started having sex, were often pregnant or lactating. So there wasn't much time after that first sexual access to actually get in there. So that nulliparity is very important, and this idea of sexual...
Oh, just imagine it describing a woman as having nulliparity. I'll go outside, touch some grass.
Reproductive value, so your whole reproductive career ahead of you. That would be the optimal time to secure a mateship with somebody, because if you can keep her as your own, you will have the optimal chance of producing most offspring with her. Now, this is not, just to get back to this idea of Mooncat kind of lampooning the idea of people consciously thinking of these things. Men and women don't think about these evolutionary goals. We don't come with goals to have so many offspring. We just come with the goal of having greater sexual desire for fertile looking mates. And over ancestral time, sex with those mates rather than infertile mates led to greater fitness. So the way I would describe it is modern men aren't queuing up outside sperm banks, even though they know that that would be a great way to improve your fitness. But you still have the desire for sex. Or even people who desire to not have children, they very rarely shut down their sexual desire along with it. So it's not like these things are conscious. We're not conscious of a lot of what we do, but the ultimate goal of why we have those drives doesn't always loom large in our mind when we're thinking like this.
Yeah, that's important because kind of at the beginning when she's going through her skit, she makes it sound like men and women are thinking about consciously all of these things. Really, we just see people and we think like, I like them, I don't like them. But it's not random who we like. It's based on certain traits, and we can observe those traits objectively, and we can quantify them. We can count the numbers and see like, oh, these are traits that people kind of tend to like. And then we can say, why do they like those traits? Mm-hmm. Yeah, once again, the theory of evolution provides a good explanation for why. Something that maybe doesn't is just like,
you know what it could also explain all of it is patriarchal culture. Let's just ignore that.
Like the standard social science model, culture in general. So take sex differences and jealousy, for example. What is the cultural or blank slate explanation for those?
I don't know. And could you teach women to be more sexually jealous and men to be more emotionally jealous? Mooncat seems to think so. I'm not sure. I don't think so. I think that's not the way to do it. Just to pick up on something you said there, Alex, about, you could observe the mate preferences and then come up with the reason why. You could also reverse order that and say, what are selection pressures? And, I wonder, are mate preferences in correspondence to that? So I'll give you an example of a recent one discovered from a guy called David Lewis.
Oh, I fucking love the lumbar curvature studies. I love this shit.
Who used to be in our lab at UT. He discovered male preference for
because suppose I mentioned this in the video, didn't I? Like men are attracted to a spine which like curves in just below the butt. So they want to see that curve that goes in just before the butt, right? Because supposedly back when we were foraging and we were gathering the berries back in the day, because you know how the men hunted the game and the women were the ones that picked the berries, right? The Meta report. The reason that we have the spine that curves in, guys, is because because we were like always having to bend down to pick the berries up from the floor, that curvature of the spine meant that we were less likely to get the spinal back injuries because from all of the bending down. Extremely plausible explanation, if you ask me.
Specific type of angle of lumbar curvature on the back. And the way he did it was a very good example of the way evolutionary hypotheses are kind of formed and how we search for evidence. So he figured the adult human female is the only species on planet Earth that has the adaptive problem of carrying a fetus while they're pregnant on 2 feet while standing up. Most other species are kind of down on all fours or whatever. So that creates a specific selection pressure for adult human women to have a strong kind of spine that's optimal for carrying this pregnancy while on 2 feet. So as such, women have a different type of spine. They have a kind of way.
So we're getting a whole different just so story now. It's because we've always had to hold the babies.
In third vertebrae up.
It's not because of the berries now. It's because of the babies.
Different to men. So he thought, this is a strong selection pressure on women. I wonder then, would men have a preference for a specific type of spine, and what type of spine and lower back would they like? He consulted with surgeons to ask them, what is the optimal distance?
Body standards for women these days, they've gone wild. Like these days, if you have the wrong type of spine, that's it. You're done for, girls. You gotta have the right type of spine. That'll be the next cosmetic procedure. To give the lumbar procedure. That'll be the next Brazilian butt lift. The lumbar procedure to make it look like you can carry more babies than the other women.
Between hyperlordosis and hypolordosis. So the optimal distance from too much slant and too little slant. And they said it would be about 45.5 degree angle. That even blind men have this preference. This is a deeply evolved thing. But it just kind of shows you can the evolutionary hypothesis in that case was reverse engineered. It was, well, what is the adaptive problem? You should have mate preferences in correspondence to that. He didn't even know if men did. He just made the prediction and found out, yes, they did. And that's the power of the theoretical framework.
Exactly.
Oh yeah, it's the power.
And that's the way it really.
That's the power of the theoretical framework, guys. Is a scientist being like, I think this really obvious cultural thing is maybe evolutionary, actually. So why don't we ask a load of guys whether they think that really obvious cultural thing is actually true? And when they go along with the very obvious cultural thing, we have a correlation. We can make a little graph because 15 of them went along with the cultural thing. And any guy that we asked who didn't go along with the cultural thing, well, we discarded them from the data because there was some sort of like, we decided that there was like some sort of an anomaly going on with them. Like one of the guys, he had like childhood trauma. One of the guys was bisexual. One of them was gay. So we were just, you know what? We just refused to include them. Because, you know, for reasons. Yeah.
It needs to be done because that's the opposite of a just so story. You have your hypothesis, you have your theory, it helps you generate the hypothesis, then the hypothesis is tested. Because you can look at preferences and be like, okay, that kind of makes sense, and maybe you get it right. But it's when you come up with that first and then you test it and you're saying, okay, and you can't be accused of a just so story in that case.
Yeah, so evolutionary psychology creates predictions a priori, so ahead of time. And David Lewis, the same researcher, actually wrote a really powerful article along with some other co-authors from our lab, a previous generation of our lab, called A How-To Guide for Evolutionary Psychology. And it's really, really good because it talks about how
Oh yeah, it's great. I read the whole thing, guys. What a read.
hypotheses are
The amount of fucking PDF files I read for that fucking video.
generated, how they're not just so stories, and how to do it properly, how to look for cultural variation. And fundamentally, evolutionary psychology predicts where you will find cultural variation. A fundamental misunderstanding of evolutionary psychology is that we just think about universality, that humans are the same everywhere. Absolutely not. If you give us enough information about the ecology, the sex ratio, parasites in the environment, we can make predictions about how cultures might vary in their psychology. Again, ahead of time.
Yeah. So there are some cultures. Is it the Hadza that has a very large extra pair parenting rate?
I think Hadza or Himba. Himba.
There we go. Yeah, I was
Brooke Skelza does it. Yeah, Himba.
So you can look at these cultures that are not weird samples, that are very distant, that have very high rates of extra pair paternity or polygamy or something. You still kind of see these sex differences and jealousy as well. You still see sexual conflict and all of these similar things, which kind of seems to say, okay, even if you have a culture that is, it would be ideal in this culture if you did not experience any jealousy or sex differences and jealousy, you still see the exact same kinds of conflicts.
Yeah, very difficult to kind of erase it. And even in terms of parental investment, there are examples of hunter-gatherer societies where they believe.
I think what you need to do to actually really have evidence of this is because, like, what they're saying is these like very isolated tribes have been looked at by people doing studies on them, but what you have to consider is that they had people from Western countries going into these tribes and taking data on the tribes, and these people from Western cultures were going in with their Western perceptions and with their own personal comparisons to how these tribes were living their lives, and they would write up reports based on their Western perceptions on how these tribes were living their lives. That's a part of it. So like there's gonna be a lot of things that these tribes do that these Western like scholars doing their studies are gonna look at, and they're gonna look at it from their own perspective. And so they're gonna write up their whole study based upon their own perspective of why they think that they're acting like that. And they might say, oh, it's because they want to ensure the paternity of the child, so that's why they do this and this and that. And a lot of studies have come out more recently that have highlighted issues with the ways that we've looked at tribes in the past, and the way that we've done studies on isolated tribes in the past. And in a lot of ways, they're very supposed like isolated tribes. In a lot of ways, they're very influenced by Western cultures because they live, a lot of them live very, very close to other civilizations, and even though they technically still live within their tribes, they're very influenced by the cultures that live closest to them because they have to sort of interact with them in some ways sometimes. But also, like, the people that are writing about them, the people that, like, go into these tribes and live in them for a while, and then, like, write their journals about them, they're still writing those journals from the perspective of a person who's grown up in a very Western culture and is sort of, like, coming, like, viewing all of their actions from the perspective of our culture. And you're never going to be able to look at that kind of stuff completely objectively.
The cultural belief is that there is shared paternity. So every man that the woman has had sex with is partially the father. And it's kind of adaptive because it diminishes that sexual jealousy, and kind of everyone invests a little bit in the offspring. But guess what you find? That the actual father, the actual biological father, invests more heavily, infrequently. So.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, I literally only just realised that there's a wire coat hanger in the middle with a lapel mic attached. Amazing setup, guys.
Yeah.
So something else she mentioned was kind of this.
I just thought that was like I thought it was a piece of art or something because of the things behind it.
Eurocentric beauty standards, because of course we're talking about mate preferences, and overlapping with mate preferences is a lot of research on attractiveness. That was one of my original interests that kind of got me initially into that, and then I realized, like, I cannot even study attractiveness without running through evolutionary psychology. So she kind of says these are Eurocentric preferences, and I think a lot of people have kind of the perception that, like, in other cultures the preferences are totally different. What do you think about this Eurocentric beauty standards thing?
Absolutely not. There's a large degree
Shut it down straight away. Absolutely not.
of consensus, particularly around female beauty, around what is a beautiful woman. You could take a group of hunter-gatherer men, Australian men, UK men, American men from different times, and they'll largely agree on who is an attractive woman and who's less attractive. Male attractiveness is it's more subjective. It's based on different things. There are some features like height that are, unfortunately for me, very important to women. But female beauty is very much linked to cues of health, youth, and fertility, because we inherited these preferences from ancestors who successfully reproduced. And those were the ones who had preferences for...
Again, they're basing it all off the gene wants to be reproduced. The gene wants to go to the next generation. We have no evidence for that. They're building it all around the concept of the gene wanting to go to the next generation.
Fertile mates, and we use youthful looking cues as cue to that fertility. There are some cultural and temporally variable preferences, like plumpness versus thinness, and it's associated with status. So sometimes in a particularly harsh environment you might prefer a plump...
Like, surely if that was true, all fucking guys would be tall now? Wouldn't you all be fucking over 6 foot if that was actually true? How the fuck do you explain why all men are not taller than all women now? How the fuck do they explain that?
Mate, because it kind of implies that she has enough resources or is not struggling. Whereas in other high resource environments, it might be more high status to be very slim because you can afford to go on a diet or whatever it might be. But what's never reversed is the waist-hip ratio. And that's a big cue.
How are they not explaining lesbians? Well, they conveniently do not explain anyone gay. They don't, apart from when they explain them as an evolutionary anomaly somehow. That was somehow beneficial to the straight people. It's great. The fucking mental gymnastics that these people will do to explain gay people is wild.
Due to youth and fertility is this narrow waist relative to wider hips. And this is seen in evidence into antiquity. So even art from thousands of years ago depicts this narrow waist, wider hips. It's so strong.
Not all of it.
That men all over the world prefer it.
Have they seen the Venus? What's that thing called? The Venus? That like the oldest image of a human that we have. What's she called? The Venus of something? No. What's she called? They found her in like the Netherlands or something. Or in Austria. What's she called? She has a clitoris and everything. The Austrian one. Willendorf! You got it. Willendorf. This is like the oldest depiction. I'm not going to get taken down. if I show this. This is the oldest depiction of a human body that we have in the history of mankind. What waist to fucking hip ratio does this have? Ah? Exactly.
Even blind men, when you actually get them to measure and what do they feel, what do they actually like, they like this waist-hip ratio. And again, this is one of the findings that Mooncat seemed to kind of thumb her nose at. And this is not Eurocentric. This is, no one is imposing Eurocentric white kind of beauty standards on hunter-gatherer societies who find these things beautiful. So it doesn't make sense. And, you know, this idea of a universal human nature in general is that's a fundamental kind of a good universalism idea for humanity. I think it's a common human nature with each other rather than anything Eurocentric. So
Yeah. A lot of what I've written about and researched was on attractiveness, and facial attractiveness in particular, other signs of attractiveness. They're very cross-culturally robust, and a lot of this research wanted to get at that. Like, is it cultural? If it's cultural, we should see very different preferences, but we actually see very similar preferences. In the case of something like adiposity as well, what you described there, so this can shift based on status. Is that not also what we would expect from kind of the evolutionary hypotheses predictions there?
absolutely, yeah, you could make that prediction if you have enough information about the ecology. What is it like? What is a cue to status? You can make predictions based on that, for sure. Yeah.
And status cues actually are also very robust. I think David Buss did a large cross-cultural study on status cues, and you see the same kinds of things there, like high intelligence, signs of education, cooperativeness, and then you see all of the antisocial traits at the bottom, like what really hurts your status, like being a liar or uncooperative and that kind of a thing.
Yeah, and with the mate preferences, it's like these are totally not arbitrary. Like, yes, there's some variation in what people prefer a little bit, but there's nobody who prefers skin with lesions all over them and kind of bad breath, crooked teeth. Nobody prefers that. No. That's just, it's not, and I think for female beauty in particular, using health, youth and fertility as your kind of guiding heuristic, that can be tremendously informative. Yeah.
To clarify for everyone, I mean, the correlation specifically for facial attractiveness.
I think like things that correlate with bad health are like generally not attractive, but you could also say that that is cultural. Like crooked teeth, you could say is also cultural. You couldn't say, like, you still couldn't say that that's evolutionarily wired into you to not be into crooked teeth, because that is also a cultural thing. And also like lesions on your face, whatever, like it's also culturally not deemed to be attractive. And those are the kinds of things that are wired into you from since you were a kid, you know. So it's not like you can say that that's universal and that would happen in whatever environment that a kid is brought up in. You still couldn't say that.
Across cultures, they're like 0.8, 0.9. There's really high agreement on what faces are attractive.
Yeah, huge.
What else was I going to say in respect to this? As far as, did she mention that woman of Willendorf figure in the video? I'm not sure if she...
I think I saw it up.
So of course, I'll put a picture of this up. This is a old artifact, the woman of Willendorf. And a lot of people point to this and they say, this is an example that very high adiposity was attractive in the past, but we know almost nothing about this. We don't know if this was, you know, a goddess figure, if this was actually attractive to people or whatever the case may be. It seems that a lot of people kind of defer to these explanations that we really don't know that much about. That can be just those stories in their own sense.
Of course, Alex, according to Mooncat, we can't know anything about the past anyway.
So he's allowed to give an example of like paintings that were done a few hundred years ago that showed a ratio between hip and butt. But as soon as I give an example that's from like 30,000 years ago, all of a sudden I'm not allowed.
So yeah, they may have been just creating this figure and kind of laughing at her as a grotesque image, but probably not. It's probably that waist-hip ratio. She's an example of it, the Mrs. Willendorf herself. She's got a great waist-hip ratio.
Yeah, that's the thing. With waist-hip ratio, I think a lot of people don't know that as well, that you can have, you know, have higher adiposity, be fatter, and have that good waist-hip ratio, or be slimmer and have that good waist-hip ratio. It's the ratio that's really important, perhaps more than the level of adiposity.
Yeah.
What is Venus of Willendorf's waist-hip ratio? Is it not the fucking opposite of what you were just saying the ideal waist-hip ratio is for a fertile woman?
So example of that is plus size model Ashley Graham, looks fantastic, is larger lady, but has that ratio. And then even the stick thin figure Victoria's Secret models, they still have that ratio. It's not like they're just boxy figures.
And where is Willendorf's ratio? Because surely her, like, she's got a fucking huge, like, fat tire. What?
It's always that ratio.
Exactly, yeah. So she talked about the replication crisis a little bit. Certainly the replication crisis is something that occurs across psychology, not just in psychology, but across pretty much anything that has to do with studying human beings. We're saying about half of these papers don't replicate or anything. So she's kind of singled out evolutionary psychology in that sense, perhaps unfairly, as like saying, oh, this doesn't replicate. We'll go into that a little bit in another slide as well. And we've talked about this extensively. So sex difference research remains among the most well-replicated research in psychology. She gave examples of like ovulatory shifts and spatial rotation. I'm not sure why she focused so much on spatial rotation, because that does actually seem to replicate the sex difference. And we'll go into that as well. But
we're going to get into rotating 3D things in our minds. Yeah, baby!
Up here list. These are also psychological adaptations that have replicated very well, okay? So the behavioral immune system, just brief explanation. Do you know what that is? Behavioral immune system?
So your behavior you kind of have an immune system behaviorally that you will learn to not go near an environment.
By the way, I have the prettiest beer lined up. I've been putting off pouring it because I don't want to have that many. But ironically, this is the most feminist beer I've probably ever had. It's called Blossom Blonde. Oh, I need to unplug this so I can actually. Blossom Blonde, brewed by women. Yeah, it's a pretty pink can. It's got a bee on it and it's got pink blossom on it. This one's for the girls. This pour is for the girls. All right.
Environments that are highly pathogenic because that's dangerous. So your behavior will act as an immune system buffer for your biological system.
Sure, bitter taste aversion. So yeah, we are averse to bitter things. Why? Probably because they're poisonous often, that sort of a thing. Core disgust, we talked about this a little bit. Disgust sensitivity, aversion to pathogens, right? That kind of a thing. Essence categorization.
She actually almost even suggested at one point in the video, I just remember, that maybe our ancestors weren't aversive to pathogens. Maybe it was just sheer luck. Yeah. And is it really likely that we just, by sheer luck, got here with an inherited aversion?
Yeah, I think luck comes into a lot of reasons why species just sort of make it. And like I'm talking about very early on, like, yeah, maybe we were just lucky. I think it's more likely that we very early on we sort of teach kids what is supposedly disgusting because we've learned it culturally. I think that's more likely, but either way, we don't know.
To pathogens, or is it likely that our ancestors who had an aversion to pathogens passed on their genes more?
Nah,
that is how traits are inherited.
I
We
don't think that's
inherit
it.
the traits from our previous generation. That seems to be lost. It seems to be like that it couldn't be actually in response to a selection pressure, that it has to have been just this messy accident spaghetti at the
Literally, a lot of evolution is messy accidents. We're all just messy accidents.
wall kind of thing. I
Messy genetic accidents.
don't know about that view of
Yeah,
evolution.
she said that kind of spaghetti at the wall. What did she mean by that, do you think?
I'm not quite sure, really. I think it's just that
You don't know what I meant when I threw the spaghetti at the whiteboard? Oh, that was all a waste of time then. All of that cleaning up.
I think she's trying to make the claim that anyone who tries to give structure to evolution as if it's kind of guided in some way is kind of suspect. She's kind of preferring to see it as just this messy, just all whatever sticks. We don't know. Evolution is just a messy bitch, she called her. And it's not quite that way because, traits are selected and are retained in response to the environment. So it's not just a complete arbitrary whatever passes on to the next generation happens to pass on to the next generation. Certain things are passed on to the generation because they were better adapted to that environment.
This is like the floweriest beer I've ever smelt in my life. What is it flavored as? It smells like actual roses or something. It's so flowery. Oh, it's brewed with elderflower, giving it a floral character and refreshing finish. It's the perfect beer to celebrate every joyful occasion. Was this written by AI? Fucking hell. Alright.
Precisely, yeah. I think a lot of people in the past used to think of evolution as very, very random because mutations are random. But the process of evolution and what's selected for is not necessarily random in that case. There is kind of a rationale and a reason to that. But so on this slide, yeah, these are a lot of things that are very, very well replicated. Preference for sweet tasting foods, that's something from evolutionary psychology there. It's probably not what people are thinking of when they're thinking of like mate preferences and like, why did we evolve oral sex or whatever? The fear of snakes is another big one, right? So snakes as a prepared stimulus, for example.
How about we don't question why we evolved oral sex and we just enjoy it, baby?
Whatever. The fear of snakes is another big one, right? So snakes as a prepared stimulus, for example. You can, this was learned very early in research on classical conditioning, even before there was kind of an evolutionary explanation for it, Seligman and that kind of a thing. Why is it so much easier to acquire a fear of snakes, right? You pair a picture of a snake with an electrical shock, then you present the fear of snake. Wow, you have a higher physiological response. Well, snakes are dangerous. These things just make so much sense. They're well confirmed.
I actually don't think I have that visceral reaction to snakes because I've never been exposed to snakes. You don't really get snakes in Britain. You get them like in Australia. Do you get them in America? I know you get them in Australia sometimes. Do you get them in America? Like, you don't get them in the UK. I don't think I've ever been faced with a snake. So like, I don't know what my reaction would actually be if I saw a snake. But like when I see one on videos or something, then like, I don't get this visceral reaction like I would scream bloody murder if I saw that in real life. Especially if it was like one that was like not venomous, or like if I'd learnt that it was venomous, I'd be scared, obviously, because I'd learnt that it was venomous and it could bite me. But otherwise, I just think snakes are kind of just cool and slinky and slimy and cool. I don't think I would be naturally scared of one if I wasn't taught that it could be dangerous, to be honest. Whereas like with spiders, I do get this sort of like visceral reaction of like, I am scared of this spider, even though I'm like sort of I'm aware of my logical brain. Like my logical brain knows that the spider can't hurt me. It would never hurt me. But there is something there that makes me extremely scared of spiders, and I don't know where it comes from. But I do think that was like possibly taught to me because like my family is like quite similar with spiders. Absolutely hated them, always have. I don't get that same feeling with snakes, to be honest. I don't get that visceral reaction when I see one like on a video, but I've never seen one. I've never like come across a snake in the wild. We just like don't get them around here. So sometimes I just like see them on TV or on videos and I'm like, oh cool, a snake. Like that, I don't feel scared. But if I see like a spider on a video, I'm like, ah! I get that feeling. Like even if I see one that I know can't touch me.
Well replicated.
But cars are very dangerous too, but you can't elicit such a fear.
But you can't with cars. That's exactly it. It doesn't work with other things in the modern environment that are dangerous. They don't work as that kind of prepared stimulus.
We don't have a deep ancestral history of a selection pressure causing us to be afraid of cars. Perhaps if long enough down the line we would develop one, but they're pretty new.
So she talks about just so stories a little bit. I guess, the alternative for a lot of this, specifically with sexual behavior and preferences, is kind of just like patriarchy, right? But it seems to me like patriarchy is also kind of a just so story. What do you think about that, maybe?
Yeah, I mean, it's a pretty nebulous kind of catch-all theory that's used to explain phenomenon. And I would point to this idea that there's some facts about modern sexual psychology that don't quite fit with patriarchy theory. So the gender equality paradox. Sex differences in some sexual psychology areas are larger in less patriarchal areas. That is just the precise opposite of what you would predict if you're saying that these sex differences
Is he talking about the fucking STEM shit?
Are largely driven by patriarchy. Less patriarchy should reduce those sex differences. That makes sense on the other.
He's talking about the fucking STEM study, isn't he? He's talking about the fucking STEM study, isn't he? He is, isn't he?
Evolutionary view, not on the standard social science model view.
Yeah. To me, it's always seemed to be the case that patriarchy is a bad explanation for...
The STEM study that I talk about in the video, the STEM The paradox STEM study?
Individual differences and that kind of a thing. It's certainly a macro explanation for society. You can look at a society where men dominate everything or are in positions of power, and you can describe that society as a patriarchy, and that's probably pretty accurate, right? You can say, I'm giving it, a description to society, it's patriarchal, great. But as far as like patriarchy shaping individual differences, why are some women higher in sociosexuality? Why are some women lower? There's no instrument that measures patriarchy. There's no patriarchy scale. It's really rarely operationalized in psychological research, but somehow it's become to be very, very popular when really it's just kind of a subjective description of like a society we live in. It's more sociology than psychology in that sense. But another topic I think that you mentioned there was kind of the exclusive homosexuality paradox. What is that?
Yeah, so that is an evolutionary puzzle.
There
There's
we go.
lots of same-sex sexual behavior
Time to explain the gays.
throughout the animal kingdom, and a recent paper found that it is adaptive because it increases pro-social behavior among same-sex individuals in that species. So you would think, oh yes, well, humans must have a relic of that too. But what is a puzzle is the exclusive homosexuality. So some humans are exclusively attracted to the same sex, and that does seem to be uniquely human and an evolutionary paradox. But like Charles Darwin, we shouldn't be
Gayness is not uniquely human. Some animals absolutely exhibit homosexuality.
afraid of these puzzles. We should try and engage with them. And it is difficult to explain some aspects of modern human sexuality, but there are some theories. Some have found good support, some have found less support. One is like the fraternal birth order effect, where the more older...
Oh, yeah. So that theory is that if you have multiple siblings, the next sibling down is like a certain percentage more likely. Like if the first sibling is a certain percentage, if the first sibling is gay, the second sibling down is like a certain percentage. Like, he's going to explain it probably.
Less support. One is like the fraternal birth order effect, where the more older brothers you have, the more likely you are to be homosexual.
That's the one. Yeah. The more older brothers you have, apparently the more likely you are to be homosexual. And they have a whole theory behind why they think this is.
Lots of these theories, but she seemed to suggest that the idea of having multiple theories, she kind of laughed at the idea that, oh, there's 10 evolutionary theories and none of them are any good. It's like, that's how you find the truth, is you keep actually trying to find evidence for your supported theory. That's, again, normal.
Yeah, and I found evidence for a completely different theory, genetically, which you don't seem to talk about.
Science.
Yeah, I hope she comes up with some theories of her own.
Right.
I fucking did, mate. Fucking watch the video. That's the thing, that's what I'm saying though, is that this whole new framework, genetic framework came out, and they just completely have ignored it. They do not want to abandon the theory that they've worked on for decades. The supposed theory that there is a gene that wants to make its way to the next generation. I've come along and I've put in my video that is quite clearly not the current scientific theory behind how genes work anymore. I made that very obvious in my video, and I explained how that then subsequently affects sexuality in humans. I tried to explain that in the most clearest way possible. They've completely wiped it from... They've watched my video, or maybe they didn't even watch the video, and they've completely wiped it from their mental slate. Everything that I said after that point, they've completely wiped it from the slate.
If she thinks
these guys are the blank slatists.
all of the evolutionary hypotheses are bad and the evolutionary theory doesn't explain anything, I mean, it doesn't seem to be the case that all of these standard social science models do either. So maybe she will figure it out herself and make a video on it.
Yeah, one thing there is a good, I think, evolutionary explanation for is an even bigger puzzle of homophobia. So on the evolutionary view, you would think as a man, it would actually be very adaptive for other men to be gay. Because you would say, oh, less competition for me, they're not interested in women, this is fantastic. But men are very homophobic, more so than women. And one evolutionary explanation is this coalitional psychology that's going.
They didn't used to be, though. Men did not used to be more homophobic than women in different cultures. You know what used to happen in ancient Greece? Men were fucking way more gay. Men were so fucking gay. That like powerful men used to have like less powerful men as like, I don't know what they called them, just like basically sexual slaves that they would use, like younger men. Like they would just fucking use them. And that the most manly thing that you could do in ancient Greece was to have another little man in lower status than you to have sex with all the time. What the fuck?
And one evolutionary explanation is this coalitional psychology that's going on, coalitional value theory, I think it's called, whereby it's actually femophobia. That it's the effeminate, more camp gay men that are more victims of homophobia. And there's a lot of evidence to point to this, that it's seeing a effeminate gay man.
Yeah, it was seen as extremely manly to be the top. Extremely manly to be the top if you were in ancient Greece.
Yeah. And there's a lot of evidence to point to this, that it's seeing a effeminate gay man is seen as less value as a coalitional partner in our ancestral history of war. We find that homophobia is most pronounced among men rather than women, directed at men rather than women. It is most common in groups of strong coalitional thinking, like team sports, military, the police.
I fucking wonder why. Like, maybe it's because those professions are the most like alpha male, bro. We need to be manly in the current culture that we're like living in right now.
Strong homophobia. And if you think about it as a coalitional partner, a feminine man in your tribe was perhaps very costly to you. And also what was very costly to you is someone who might be gay. When going to war, was one of the main motives for that was to acquire mates. So that maybe explains the homophobia. It's like, I can't motivate this guy to go to war with me, he's not that interested, so that, again, the evolutionary line of thinking leads to some explanations of an otherwise a puzzle. I guess everything else would just be just a just so story of, people are homophobic because they're taught to be, or I don't know.
They just are, and no explanation. It's also...
I do give explanations, but you've reduced that to no explanation yet again because you just want to ignore it.
It's interesting that insults like that also kind of target traits that are valuable in men. So a very, very common insult, one of the top ones is, calling another man gay or something like that. So what does that do? It devalues that man in the eyes of other men and also in the eyes of women, like, oh, he's not a viable partner for you. So a lot of the insults that we have also kind of reflect an evolutionary history. We're insulting the traits that are found valuable by the opposite sex to kind of lower their mate value in that sense.
Yeah, so women derogate each other's promiscuity most often because that's seen as valuable to men. So, it can be informative about that. But even the same-sex aggression, the intrasexual competition, was something that Mooncat seemed to laugh at, which I didn't quite understand that either. It's like...
Also, that was one study that looked at how much hair female hairdressers cut off of supposedly intrasexual competitive women who came into their hair salons, and if they were if they were close enough on the attractive scale, but like maybe slightly more, this study basically said that they were more likely to cut off more of their hair, even if their hair was healthy. It's one of the shittest studies I have ever read in my life. Like, the amount of hair that they're literally talking about in this study was like a matter of millimeters. And they somehow, because they reduced it to millimeters of hair, they somehow managed to make it statistically significant. Like the difference. Finding
an explanation for intrasexual competition seems like a worthy mission. I don't know. What's her explanation for same-sex aggression?
I have no idea. But
it doesn't exist. That's my explanation, because all of the studies around it were extremely biased, as is pretty much everything in psychology.
It's interesting because a lot of the researchers that she pulled up, interviews with Chris Williamson or Jordan Peterson, these are a lot of women that are evolutionary psychologists, as well as the research that she was kind of making fun of on intersexual competition and all of that. I think the top researcher in that field is Joyce Benenson, also a woman in that sense. It doesn't seem to be the case that this is necessarily a field dominated by men. Certainly psychology broadly is about 70% female. Is your experience at these conferences and everything mostly women? Or?
No, it seems to tack on to the the kind of trend in general psychology, more women these days than men. But throughout the recent decades, there's been fantastic female evolutionary psychologists. Joyce Benenson looks from an evolutionary view, Tanya Reynolds.
Yeah, both of them have been on Chris Williamson's podcast. And I looked at the studies of both of them. Like, I never even said in my video that it's all men who are evolutionary psychologists and they all say this, and that, and no women are doing this. I very clearly point out some women who are evolutionary psychologists as well. And many of them have been on Chris Williamson's podcast and they have talked about their research. And I showed their research in the video and I showed how shit it was. And I showed the sample sizes of all of their studies in the video and explained why I thought that they were shit. At no point did I say, no women are doing this. Of course they do. Women are just as misogynistic as men a lot of the time. They really are.
Jamie Krenz, Diana Fleischman, there's tons. Leda Cosmides, right from the beginning, one of the founders of the field. Incredible scientist, you know.
Yeah, far from being a field dominated by old white men, it's actually quite diverse. We are a minority. We are the oppressed minority in this case. Even with the ovulatory shift research, I mean, one of the lead researchers there, Hesselton, a woman as well, right?
Yeah.
So lots of things. She mentioned as an explanation for some of these things, stereotype threat.
One of the most prominent women in the field, Sarah Hill, who you haven't mentioned. I did an entire section talking about Sarah Hill and how much full of shit she is.
The idea that stereotyping individuals can kind of reduce their ability. So, for example, if you've grown up in an environment that says men are good at math, women are bad at math, that's enough to kind of cause this sex difference in math performance or something like that. So she talked a lot about replication. I'll put the slide up here, but this is interesting because a lot of what she refers to as an explanation, this is coming from the standard social science model, stereotype threat classically does not replicate. Mm-hmm. Any thoughts on that? I don't know what else needs to be said on that.
I would just say that even stereotypes themselves actually replicate quite well. A researcher called Lee Jussum, and he researches the truth of stereotypes, how many are actually based on some degree of truth or reality. And he kind of made a joke to me one time that it's the easiest line of research ever because stereotypes often tend to be based on something. Like humans create stereotypes based on something. There's very few that are kind of not based on anything. One, actually, that's been debunked, a stereotype, is that women who have a lot of casual sex have low self-esteem. And actually, guess who it was debunked by? An evolutionary psychologist, Jamie Krenz. So there you go.
Yeah, that one makes sense. And I feel like that was a stereotype maybe.
Evolutionary psychologists keep on debunking themselves, and therefore the field is legit.
I think sometimes these are opinions that get pushed and they're verging on a stereotype and then they don't get to that point. But yeah, some of these very broad stereotypes, they probably reflect a sort of heuristic decision making. If an effect size is large enough, it should be, from Cohen's effect sizes conventions. Like if it's a medium effect size, it should be something that you can see, with close observation or all of that. So it makes sense that stereotype threat, or stereotype accuracy, I should say, is one of the more well replicated things. Stereotype threat, on the other hand, not really. There's a lot else that the standard social science model has given us that doesn't replicate. So now we're kind of moving into the replication section here. If you go to this website, Replicability Index, I think that's by Šimek. How do you say his name?
Šimek, I think, yes.
You do much better with the names than I do. I'm like, how do you say this? So yeah, behavioral priming doesn't replicate, construal level theory, ego depletion, implicit bias research, which has been used, very politicized as a related to race and DEI and all of that. This is something as well that does not seem to replicate. Mm-hmm. Stereotype threat, as we mentioned, implicit self-esteem. So there's a lot of these, and all of these have come from the standard social science model, from the blank slate. None of these big influential theories that have actually had a pretty big impact on psychology and then have fallen to the replication crisis, none of these have come from evolutionary psychology.
Yeah, that's a point that's not made enough. Yeah, evolutionary psychology could actually be an antidote to the replication.
Yeah, the only parts of evolutionary psychology that have not fallen victim to the replication crisis are the studies which basically were measuring how people act within cultures. That's always replicable. If you're expected to act in a certain way within a culture and you're aware of the way that you're supposed to act within a culture, generally you can replicate that, i.e. a woman being less likely to say that she'd like to sleep around than a man. You can generally replicate that, and you can replicate that across different cultures. And it's not surprising either that you can replicate that. What is very difficult to replicate in psychology is finding universal ways in which people act that are not culturally defined, such as finding certain situations in which a person will be like dishonest or lie in a certain way, or will do a certain thing when they're lying, or will act a certain way when they're feeling a certain emotion. All of that is very cultural, and it's hard to replicate when you look at the wider picture scientifically. All of that stuff's harder to replicate. But when you ask people about things that they're aware of how they're supposed to act in that culture, generally you're going to be able to replicate that every time.
Exactly, precisely. Another one that she mentioned in here, this is interesting because this is a newer paper. This is on the myth of man the hunter. So there was a paper published, it was in 2023, it was just last year. The myth of man the hunter, women's contribution to the hunt across ethnographic contexts. So we see big sex differences classically in hunting behavior. We see big sex differences in physical aggression, willingness to go to war, all kinds of things like this. We see this across the thing. Recent paper by these authors, they said, no, actually, women hunt all the time too. They found in their paper that 79% of women hunted, 33% hunt big game. So they're kind of trying to call this into question. Like, actually, women hunt a lot more than was expected in Man the Hunter, which was this large ethnographic collection of observations from anthropologists that men hunt more than women do. When this came out, I immediately went through the data, and I went through just all of the African countries myself, and I noticed like, oh, these are not actually lining up. The way that they coded these, in many cases, even the exact opposite of what was said in the original paper, and I wrote an article on that. And then I think it went out on Aporia, and then some anthropologists did a better paper that they published on this more recently. Yeah. So it's interesting that she would cite this, because this is also something that does not replicate and has fallen to a replication very recently published right now. So
what do you mean doesn't replicate? 79% of women hunt, 33% hunt big game. Turns out it's fake. Exclusion of 30%. 35% of forager cultures. Of 53 out of 63 women hunt cultures, recoding found that women rarely or never hunted. Okay, so this is again like this is again the ways in which you manipulate data. So what I was looking at in my video was a meta-analysis of decades and decades of studies which had looked at hunter-gatherer societies and made notes of how they live their lives day to day and the gender differences of how they live to life, and like what the kids do and what the adults do, what the women do, what the men do, blah, 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 blah. And this meta-analysis looked at decades and decades of it. And they wrote up this whole thing that was basically like, we found that actually women hunt game far more than what has been notated in all of these studies and what's been understood generally, because for decades we as a Western culture have sort of assumed that the men did all of the hunting whereas the women didn't. And this meta-analysis came along and was like, actually women do loads more of it. I mean, turns out it's fake. I mean, I would have to look into this deeply to figure out what they mean by turns out it's fake. I mean, that's a very big accusation. Turns out it's fake. I mean, what you have to do with these things is sort of like look at the data and look at the assumptions that they've made. Like recoding. What the fuck do you mean by recoding? Here, scientists say media storm around myth of man in the Hunter study was unjustified and misleading. That's the thing. That's the thing about manipulating data. You can manipulate it in many different ways. That's not the kind of thing that I'm going to be able to debunk sitting right here, right now, talking to you. It would involve probably a fucking weeks, months of research, but yeah.
Turns out basically that the results here were fake. They excluded something like 35% of forager countries. Only recoding of 50 of 63 of these found that women rarely or never hunted in 16 of 50 of those. So there was a lot of problems kind of up in the slide here going forward with that. And looking at these errors across this, many cultures with no women hunting in them were excluded. Many inclusion of women hunting where women don't hunt as all, as I kind of mentioned when I looked at the data as well. What do you think of this, kind of these sex differences in hunting behavior?
Well, I think that the kind of the methodological and interpretation of the data flaws have been well highlighted by yourself and that recent Evolution and Human Behaviour paper that came out. But at a higher level of analysis here, there's a kind of a conceptual problem whereby there's certain type of people now who are kind of seeing the male default as almost better, and that there's an admirable goal to try and show that women could be just like men. So I think there's an interesting story about our ancestral environment. That's
not the goal. That's not the goal. It's an attempt to find the truth. And it's just an awareness that we look at other things and we look at data through our own lenses. And our lenses are very, very tainted by our own experiences. It's just an awareness of that.
Of hunting and kind of representing women better in that. So there's a lot of evidence that many cultures, most of the calories came into the society from the foraging, and that the hunting for big game was actually a lot of status striving and just kind of big swinging dicks from the men, which may have been useful and important in creating group cohesion.
That's a wild assumption in itself. Dick swinging. He's making wild assumptions about dick swinging.
Of itself, but why can't there be a difference and women's role valued and men's role valued?
What about tit swinging, bro? Were the women not tit swinging?
Other evidence I've heard of lately is that with the big hunting, women were actually quite powerful in deciding when that happened and why that happened. And it was often to say, hey, if you want to be sexually selected, you better go bring me some mammoth or bring me something. And they would send the guys out and we actually...
Bro needs to bring me some mammoth before he gets any puss. You ain't getting no puss unless you bring me some mammoth.
Control of when the hunts happened. Now that's very interesting. And all of that's positive retelling of the story. You don't need to massage the data into suggesting that there was no sex differences. I don't see why sex differences are automatically seen as favouring men. So, for example, men have greater desire for sexual variety. Why is the answer to that problem to say, so do women? It's fine to be different. I don't understand why it's more moral or better to...
Nobody's saying it's moral or better. We're all just trying to find what's really going on here. And we're trying to find the truth. No one's striving for whatever's moral or better evolutionarily. We're all just trying to figure out what the fuck's actually going on and what the data's actually showing us. And you guys, you're still working off a theory that's decades out of date. And we're working on newer theories that track with how we understand what genetics work and what they do right now.
Say women can be just as promiscuous as men. It just doesn't make sense. I don't know why they're having this default. And you kind of even see it with modern jobs, like, CEOs, they're all men. And, that's a problem. It's like, I don't know,
Yeah, particularly a good point.
You don't know why that might be a problem, that men are in higher paid jobs than women. You don't realise why that might cause a little bit of a problem in society? No, okay.
Point you made there, yeah. In a lot of these cultures, gathering is very, very important. Foraging provides a majority of the calories, and also they're calories that are persistent, so they're every day, where hunting might become more sporadic. We really kind of value that role in a sense, and I'm not entirely sure why. There's probably, some status associated with it, like you said there. But that's one of the things I think that kind of drives these very motivated hypotheses. Like, we're going to go and we're going to retell kind of the myth in a sense to favor women more, even if it doesn't actually favor women more, even if the actual story there is not that like women need to hunt as much as men. It's probably more like, hey, women are doing something that's actually maybe more crucial than going off and playing. I remember when I was reading those papers, kind of recoding the data, one description of men hunting was like, it literally just said they were lazy, that they take their bow and they just go play in the woods. And it was like, okay, well, that's maybe not what you're thinking of. Is like hunting is like, oh, it's so crucial, he's bringing back the mammoth. I don't know. Mooncat, does she believe mammoths are real? Maybe she doesn't. She seems to think cavemen are very fun.
We have no way of knowing.
Yeah, we don't know if mammoths are real.
We interact with them, maybe not.
Maybe not.
Total fluke if we encounter them. But yeah, it's this lionizing of the male default and minimizing of sex differences. I just don't understand it.
That's going to be my new conspiracy theory. that I start up. Mammoths aren't real.
What's the motive there? Yeah.
Yeah. So certainly she's going on about replicability and all of that. And she seems to imply that replicability in evolutionary psychology is actually lower than in other things. But here is a list.
I don't think I said that. I think what I pointed out was that replicability in psychology is generally low. And science as a whole, the replicability crisis is very bad, but it's especially in psychology, it's low. I don't think I said anything specifically about evolutionary psychology being lower than the rest of psychology. Apologies if I did say that, but I don't think I did actually say that.
List of journals in which we have high rates of replication versus low rates. Personality research, so research on individual differences, like sex differences.
I've not watched my own video back. To be honest, I don't like watching myself back. I do edit my own videos, but I hate it. So like once I've put a video out, I don't like watching it back again. But I've not watched it in a while, but I don't think I said that.
Is that kind of a thing. Evolutionary psychology, they actually kind of have the highest replication rates here, right? Mm-hmm. We see this rankings out of 121 journals. In the top 10, what do we see? A bunch of journals from personality psychology, evolutionary psychology, and research on sex differences, right? Like sex roles is one of them, that journal. So, yeah, I mean, what do you think about that? Evolutionary psychology is not less replicable than anything else. It's probably more replicable.
Yeah, you also had archives of sexual behavior in there, evolutionary psychology itself, always consistently replicable and increasingly so, and increasingly powerful. The impact factor of our flagship journal, Evolution and Human Behavior, is on an upward trajectory. So evolutionary psychology is gaining a stronger foothold.
Opposite. It's losing out. It's really losing out.
Just return to the woman the hunter kind of debacle 1 second. I would be embarrassed to have endorsed that woman the hunter thing so strongly, and then when the new evidence came out about the way the data was massaged, I would want to walk that back. But I've seen no concession from any of the champions of that research. They cannot acknowledge that actually, the data didn't actually favour our theory. Unlike what evolutionary psychologists do when the data doesn't support our theories. We walk it back immediately and go for a different theory. This is a fundamental difference that should be highlighted.
It sounds like someone's being tortured in the background.
I think.
Yeah, it's really a difference in the way people who are very ideologically motivated think, like, this is scoring points for my team, I got it, versus people who are maybe a little bit less motivated by ideology and who are just like, I just kind of want to figure out what's going on here, and I don't really care the way that falls. I mean, that's the way I feel about a lot of this research, is like, I don't care if the ovulatory shift is real or not. I just want to know if it's real or not. I don't care if women hunt as much as men or not. I would just kind of like to know if they do or not. Yeah. So comparing across subdisciplines in psychology, I'll put this slide up here. The standard social science modeler, the blank slate, it probably has more of a replicability crisis. I mentioned a bunch of things from that. The
SSS specifically has a replicability crisis. Discipline-wide investigation of the replicability of psychology papers over the past 2 decades: social psychology, cognitive psychology, developmental, clinical, organizational, personality. Mean replication score of the subfield. Social psychology has 25% replication. Cognitive psychology, i.e. the field that produces sex differences and spatial ability, 54% replication.
We're big theories that have all fallen to the replication crisis. Here's a chart that shows, I didn't look at evolutionary psychology. I think you're probably going to be the first one to do something specifically on the replicability of evolutionary psychology. But at the top of this, one of the most replicable subdomains in psychology is actually personality psychology, which personality psychology, if people don't know that, that is where you study a lot of sex differences. It overlaps very highly with evolutionary psychology. Like, I came into evolutionary psychology from personality psychology. That was my background there.
David Buss was a personality psychologist before an evolutionary psychologist.
Precisely. It overlaps a lot. If you're looking at, a lot of relationship behavior, things like the dark triad, personality differences, all of this is personality psychology. This has a very high replication rate. What has a low replication rate? Social psychology. That's where you're going to find all of your standard social science model stuff. Social psychology. But
yeah, 54% is terrible. 25% is absolutely awful.
Low replication, that's kind of what she's got going on there. 25% replication rate. So
yeah. I eagerly await the Mooncat debunks social psychology video.
Yeah, Mooncat debunks social psychology, small sample sizes, which I think might actually be...
Yeah, I mean, that's also a terrible field. It really is.
Weird sample sizes, yeah.
Oh yeah, she implied that there was kind of some academic fraud going on there. I know she mentioned the Gino affair. What's her name? Francisca Gino?
Francisca Gino,
Francisca Gino. She was not an evolutionary psychologist.
Nope.
She's an economist.
I think so, yeah. I'm not as familiar with her background, but I know
She's a behavioral psychologist.
the scandal,
Well, yeah, but she's definitely not. And her research had nothing to do with evolutionary psychology. I don't think an evolutionary psychologist has ever been taught for fraud.
I can't think of any scandal. Some people might point to the use of
Evolutionary psychologists don't really need to do fraud, though. Because all you really need to do as an evolutionary psychologist is be like, well, look what I found. Look, I found this cultural thing that we all do. Therefore, it's probably evolutionarily built into us in some way. Whereas Francesca Gino, she was a behavioral psychologist, and what she did was she conducted the study which supposedly proved that if you... Ironically, the study that she did was on honesty. And she did this study where she made people sign a form, an honesty signature promise at the top of a form. And she compared that with people who signed the honesty declaration at the bottom of a form. And she found that people are more likely to be honest on that form if they sign it at the top than at the bottom. And she basically came out, after this study, she came out and said that she'd had this huge revelation that people were far more likely to be honest on a form if they signed it at the top versus at the bottom. And as a behavioral psychologist, what you can do is you can make a lot of money, which is why you're kind of incentivized as a behavioral psychologist to kind of cook your numbers a little bit. Because if you come out with like a huge revelation like that, what you can then do is get people like insurance companies to pay you for consultancy. Because, obviously as an insurance company, what you're doing a lot is you're getting your customers to fill out forms about how they drive their car, how they use their house, or how they live their lives. For example, if they're applying for health insurance. And if you make, these insurance companies are going to be like, oh, well, psychologically, if people are signing a form at the top saying they're going to be honest about what they're going to say in this form, as opposed to them signing it at the bottom, then I'm going to get more honest answers about this person applying for this insurance than they are if they're going to be less honest if they sign it at the bottom of the form. And like insurance companies, obviously, they're going to be so interested in that kind of research. And if she truly found some real revelation in human psychology there, then that's really fucking valuable to insurance companies. So Francesca Gino, she, her and this other psychologist, I forget his name, they worked together, and they basically told everyone that they'd found this revelatory finding that was universal in psychology, which was you're more honest if you sign the form at the top than at the bottom. And they're incentivized to do that, because then if they come out and they say that they found this new thing that nobody's found before, all of the insurance companies are going to come along and give them loads of fucking money because they want to know more about the psychology of their customers. Insurance companies really want to know how to manipulate their customers to get more money out of them. They really do. So behavioral psychologists are really incentivized to cook numbers. And basically it came out that she cooked her numbers. Francesca, it took a team of investigative data analysts from they have a blog. This is from memory. It was called Data Colada. This is their blog, the Data Colada blog. And they basically exposed how she did the whole thing. This is all on their blog. But it comes down to there was an Excel spreadsheet, and she literally just changed the numbers in the Excel spreadsheet. She just fucking changed them. And these guys figured it out because they got access to the original Excel spreadsheets that she put together during the study, and they like found that there was like anomalies in the order of the cells in the original Excel spreadsheet. It'd be good if I could find the original blog post that they did about her. But yeah, it's all on this. It's all on this website. It's like it's proper nerd shit, but it's good. It's good.
IQ data from the Lynn data set or something, as maybe perhaps they would consider that fraud, but there hasn't been nearly as big a scandal as this, for sure.
Yeah, people would probably call that bad methods because they, collecting samples they say are not representative or whatever. But I don't think anyone's caught them just like straight up faking data like in the Geno affair. But in social sciences more broadly, that's certainly occurred. I've put up some examples here. Eric Stewart, very famously, he was fired, I think, from the University of Florida. He created decades of fake data on systematic racism or systemic racism there. All from this year, Claudine Gay, plagiarism. Well, here's a list. I have 5 people on here who all have been kind of busted for plagiarism this year. Every one of these individuals is involved in DEI research, ironically enough, or was in a DEI administration at that point. So it doesn't seem to be the case that we're seeing a lot of academic fraud from evolutionary psychology. I can't think of an evolutionary psychologist who's actually been busted for a fraud or had their data like, you made this data up. But it does happen in some of these other fields, perhaps.
Mooncat debunks DEI.
Mooncat debunks DEI.
Yeah, next video.
So she did talk about these supposedly small samples and all that. Do you think evolutionary psychology uses small samples?
Precisely the opposite. Some of our seminal findings, if you go as far back as 89, large cross-cultural samples with thousands of participants. So it's like this idea, this accusation, this charge of being small, weird samples is totally not applicable, not appropriate.
Yeah, it really isn't. And I think a lot of people get confused about what a small sample is. I've written about statistics on the website a bit. So I think people are kind of confused about how a sample of 1,000 people can represent the whole US population or whatever. But up on this slide, I went through all of the most recent papers published in a journal, Feminism and Psychology, and I compared them with all of the most recent samples taken from the journal Evolutionary Psychology. And so what do we see here? We see sample sizes in Feminism and Psychology, 14, 24, 71, 21, 23, 112, and 18. So the average here, or the median, I guess, is 23, their sample size in this feminist psychology journal. Very small samples are very, very common in research like this that tend to be more qualitative or something like that. They're pretty common in disciplines like neuroscience as well. If you look in evolutionary psychology, on the other hand, here we have a median sample size of 356. So to compare, the average median, or I should say the medium psychology sample from this other paper here, it's only 60. Yeah. So that's about what you're working with across psychology broadly. Evolutionary psychology actually seems to be using much larger samples than we see.
The most recent studies published from what you've selected from these two fields.
Across psychology broadly, evolutionary psychology actually seems to be using much larger samples than we see in other fields, particularly if you begin to look at like feminist research, qualitative data. Then you're looking at like, I interviewed 10 people.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the data shows it there, but yeah, who's interested in data when you can just have an ideological point?
Yeah, exactly. So we'll see if she goes back.
Who cares about data, baby, when you've got an ideological point to make? Exactly. And you guys aren't doing this at all. No.
Debunks qualitative research with sample sizes of 10 as well. So the gender similarities hypothesis, she spent a little bit of time on this one as well. Probably in addition to the ovulatory shift, which she spent some time on.
Oh, you know what? I forgot to do that. Before the UK section, I forgot to do the fucking BBC theme. Didn't I? I forgot to do the BBC theme today. Terrible of me.
I think this was the only other thing she actually spent like a lot of time on. And it was from this paper by Hyde in 2005. Which was 20 years ago, so old papers.
Throw it out.
I don't know what her cutoff for an old paper is. Yeah. But it was a good paper, though. So the better our research, the more gender differences collapse. That's a quotation from Mooncat there that she said, the better our research, the more gender differences collapse. And she referenced this paper by Hyde. It was a review of these 46 meta-analyses. But I read this paper, and it turns out that Hyde actually found the same large sex differences in sexual attitudes and behavior that we see in evolutionary psychology. This is not a refutation. It didn't show that those gender differences collapsed. She actually said the exact same thing.
Yeah. So, yeah, the exact opposite of her prediction.
The exact
She said, what same thing?
psychology. This is not a refutation. It's in sexual attitudes.
A second area in which large gender differences are found is some but not all measures of sexuality. Gender differences are strikingly large for incidences of masturbation and for attitudes about sex in a casual, uncommitted relationship. So, like, literally what I've already said. Like, culturally, men are more comfortable with masturbating more and are more cultural with sex in a casual, uncommitted relationship. And she said that in her study that she did fucking ages ago.
Attitudes and behavior that we see in evolutionary psychology. This is not a refutation.
20 years ago. The other stuff that she says in that study is like she's debunking a lot of the other stuff, but she does say that those differences persist. But they're clearly cultural.
It didn't show that those gender differences collapsed. She actually said the exact same thing.
Yeah. So, yeah, the exact opposite of her prediction.
The exact opposite of what she said there. And these are sex differences in...
But look who we've got, our old friend. Yay! Woo! Yay!
Aggression is the big one, right? So sex differences in aggression, why would we expect that from the evolutionary point of view?
Well, it's not very adaptive for women throughout our...
Across several meta-analyses, aggression has repeatedly shown gender differences that are moderate in magnitude. The gender differences in physical aggression is particularly reliable and is larger than the gender difference in verbal aggression.
ancestral environment to pursue an aggressive strategy. If it's very costly to you and your fitness as a woman, if you get injured, your fitness is likely incurs a very heavy cost. If you get injured, you struggle to take care of your offspring. If you get injured as a man, you're likely to be able to actually still reproduce. Also, you have a deep ancestral history of contest competition, where men actually achieved mating success by fighting other men. There's a lot of details about our morphology, our thicker skulls and specific parts.
Yeah, there's nothing that turns me on more than a guy that gets into fucking fights with a man all the time. There's literally nothing that turns me off more.
So the skull, better throwing strength, better striking strength, greater upper body strength, larger overall. I think there's some statistic like the average man is 90% more stronger than the average woman, or has 90% more upper body strength. Huge. Then specifically again with striking, you also find a deep ancestral history of contest competition whereby a lot of male skulls are found with blows to the left side of their head, indicating that a right-handed fighter kind of hit them a lot.
Yeah.
You find a conspicuous absence of fertile-aged female skulls in our ancestral environment because women were obviously absorbed into the other tribe in wartime, whereas men were just kind of killed off. Yeah, I always say you could never have a man could never just leave his family and society and absorb into another tribe, really. It was just killed. And you see this with chimps as well.
Yeah, absolutely. In addition to sex differences...
Well, that goes against Tara Swart's theory that men in tribes constantly went to other tribes and impregnated all of the women in the other tribes, and therefore that's why they all sync their periods, so that they could all assure that they were all fertile for when the male from the other tribe came over. So who's right there?
Differences in aggression, which are very robust and well replicated. It's certainly not a personality difference that has collapsed at all. She also mentioned spatial rotation. She was talking about this, and she was kind of picking up papers here like... Finally, spatial rotation. Oh, this shows it. This doesn't. In this same paper by Hyde, she...
I did say this in my video, actually, didn't I? That I did this test. I did this test online, and I got one of the top percent... I can't remember what it was exactly. It was one of the top percentiles. I am an ultra ubermensch when it comes to rotating images in my head.
Referenced. You see consistent differences in spatial rotation tasks, right? And I'll just put the chart up here. It's in the same slide so people can see it. But that's actually something else that's pretty well replicable. I'm not sure why.
I think that's just because I've spent my entire life playing Theme Hospital / The Sims.
She said that wasn't replicable. Another thing she said there was throwing ability and distance. That's replicated very well. And that's also a very, very large sex difference. A Cohen's D of like 2.1, 2.2, and that sort of a thing. So you mentioned that a little bit. Throwing ability and distance. Why might that?
Yeah, so humans, one of our kind of best qualities as a group, throwing became very important to kind of outcompete other species and like kind of hunt. You could group together and wear an animal down by throwing at it. And men were responsible for most of the hunting, so they developed a far greater throwing ability. This sex difference is massive, and it emerges...
I'm rotating their skulls in my mind right now.
...among 3-year-olds. So it's not to do with training, and even in the studies they've controlled for training about throwing, of which maybe boys play baseball more. They controlled for all of that. Still a massive sex difference. And again, Alex, could you just really highlight how high that D is? That it is unheard of in psychology.
Matt, highlight how high the D is, please. Highlight how high Cohen's D is.
Sure. So a Cohen's D of 2.18. I'll put up an image.
How high did the D get in this instance?
For this to show how big that is. But this is the kind of size where you say, okay, you know, if you have a small Cohen's D, if you have a small difference, you can say, okay, there's a lot of overlap. You know, a lot of men are going to be like a lot of women. You start getting into Cohen's D of like two standard deviations difference.
Was it just a semi-D or?
Then you see, okay, almost all men are better at this than almost all women.
Yes.
It's kind of what you're looking at. I think that's probably a good lay explanation. Mm-hmm. These sex differences in spatial abilities, throwing, right? Because here's the thing. Visual spatial abilities, rotation, mental rotation tasks, those are also related to throwing, accuracy, and all of that. This is, again, not just weird samples. The paper I put up here...
I'm going to stream Minecraft just to prove y'all wrong.
Hunter-gatherer theory of sex differences and spatial abilities, data from 40 different countries, right? Mm-hmm. So these are things that we see across culture. And like you said, even when you control for all of these cultural explanations, these persist, and they persist to be very, very large. That's basically the story there, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Gender similarities argument. She said that, and that's kind of the paper there, right? That by Hyde. She said there's gender similarities, basically that there's more similarities than they are different. And the reason I think Hyde said that in this is because we see sex differences. Across all of these different things, these meta-analyses in this paper by Hyde, we see that there's sex differences. They haven't collapsed. The meta-analyses show that. But individually, they're very small. So that's kind of what her argument was there. But it's not the case that a bunch of individual sex differences that are small don't add up to a very big difference in the overall picture between men and women.
And the specific areas where there are differences that will persist in this massive meta-analysis are the ones that fit with the different selection pressures facing each sex. So they're the ones you would expect by an evolutionary view. You would expect similarities in some of these areas of personality, that there's no real major difference or reason for there to be a difference. So
exactly, yeah. And another interesting paper, I'll just put that up on the screen real quick. Sex differences in spatial abilities persist even for experts in STEM, arts, and sports. So like you said, you mentioned that. Even controlling for these things, training, right? So even when you have people that you expect to be really good at spatial differences, really good at artistic ability, all of these things, you still see big sex differences between men and women. They still...
Even after 2 weeks training, they're basically saying that there's a huge difference still. I mean, yeah, but also you have to... It's impossible to control for these things, but you have to control for stereotype threat, which they're saying is not a thing. But it's impossible to control for... You don't know how much someone's threatened by a stereotype imposed on them by society since birth. Yeah, it's just also like cultural expectations of how well you're going to do at a thing. Like that, a 2-week training course, it can reduce those differences. It's never going to mitigate the difference as a whole.
Still remain quite large, even among experts.
Carol Hooven wrote a great article about why men have an advantage in chess, for example, where you wouldn't really expect them to necessarily have one, but they do.
Mm-hmm. So she acted like there was some kind of consensus perhaps on sex differences, or that there was a lack of consensus, or that the consensus was that these are small. Here's another paper, I'll put it up here. Global Sex Differences in Personality, Replication with an Open Online Dataset. So she mentioned, like, what do we need to do in personality and evolutionary psychology? We need pre-registration and open data. Yeah, this has all of it. We need big samples. Yeah, we got it. This is 21,000 US participants, 31,000. And what do we see here? That overall sex differences in personality have a Mahalanobis distance of about 2. So I put actually the histograms, or not the...
We're talking about personality within Western civilizations. Wow, what a surprise.
Well, yeah, the overlapping histograms there up to see, so people can kind of visualize what that is. But that's when you take all of these little differences, kind of like in the Hyde paper where they're like, oh, people are more similar than not because the distances, because the differences between individual traits, when you kind of add that all up, you get a really, really big picture. And this kind of goes back to stereotype accuracy. They have a section in this, they say, implications for stereotypes. Why do we have these stereotypes and why do they seem to be accurate? Because the differences are big enough overall in the big picture between men and women. We can easily categorize people like, that's a man, that's a woman.
Yeah, for sure. And just to pick up on it, I noticed you mentioned some of the future guidelines that she mentioned about pre-registering.
These guys don't realize that culture is such a circular thing. It's such a circular thing. From the moment we're born, we are indoctrinated into a culture where there are expectations put on you as a woman or as a man, and that affects the way in which your genes basically are reacting to the environment that you are in. Not only your psychological genes, but your physical genes as well. Your physical genes, such as your height, or even the color of your skin, they are reacting to the environment that you are in, that you grow up in. And psychologically, your genes are, from birth, they are wiring themselves into cultures. And what these guys don't seem to realize is that, what they're assuming is when those genes are being wired into the culture when you're very young, what they're kind of assuming is that you're just born that way. But we have no evidence for that. What we do have evidence for is that you're being wired in from a very young age into the culture that you are brought up in. And culture is very, very circular. So as a young person, the more you see older people in your community doing certain things, the more you are likely to see those things and think, well, I could also do that. It's so circular. So the more people do things, the more you absorb that, and then you exude that. And the more you exude that, then the more other people will absorb it and then exude it, and then that other people absorb it. And it's like a circular thing that happens. That's how cultures regenerate, and that's how they evolve over generations. And it's the small changes that people make, i.e. the progressive people, essentially. The small changes that progressive people make in society, such as, the first people who said, it's okay that I'm gay, or Rosa Parks, who was, who refused to give up her seat on the bus that one day, or whatever. It's those first people who make those little changes in culture. They start off like circles of reactions where other people react to that action, and then people react to that reaction, and then other people react to that reaction. And the young people that are being born into that culture, they're looking at all of this stuff happening. And when they're born, when they're very young, it's being wired in a very fundamental way that lasts for their entire life. Because if brains didn't work that way, if we really were wired to do specific things from the point that we were born, that would not be a very efficient way for the brain to work, just scientifically. To be wired to act in very certain ways. Our brains aren't even big enough to even fathom that. You've got to think, the way that psychology works, the way that your brain works, everything comes down to efficiency. That's why we're all so susceptible to confirmation bias, because your brain is constantly looking for ways to make shortcuts. When your eyes look at things, or when your ears hear things, your brain is making predictions about what it should see, or what it should hear, or what it should smell, or what it should feel, before your senses even get there and bring the signal to your brain. Your brain is already making assumptions and predictions about what your senses are going to see or find before anything tangible even makes its way into your brain. Like everything that your brain is built around it's built around efficiency, and it's constantly predicting what's going to come next. And one of the most efficient things that your brain ever does is when it's very young, it will just wire itself into whatever it perceives in early infancy. It will just wire that in. It will perceive things and wire them in. It's not efficient to have things pre-wired in before you're born. It's sufficient to be a bit of a blank, not complete blank slate, but to be mostly a blank slate that is wired into culture after it's popped out of the womb. That's the most efficient way for a brain to work.
Making predictions before you gather the data. Evolutionary psychology does all of those things far better than most of social psychology. She also mentioned adversarial collaborations. Again, an idea championed by Corey Clark, who often uses an evolutionary.
Yeah, like the most, like there are loads of examples of this, but like a good example of the way that your brain is just making predictions a hell of a lot of the time is like you have a blind spot in both of your eyeballs where in the back of your eyeball there is a hole where every, like all of the, what do they call it, the veins or whatever, the optic nerves, they have to go into your brain at the back of your eyeball. So both of your eyeballs actually have a blind spot where that hole is, where the optic nerves have to go up to your brain. So like when you close one eye and you look at things with one eye, there's actually a blind spot where you can't see your hand. You're like, but you don't see that most of the time because your brain's just fucking making up what's there. Your brain is just predicting shit and that's the same for like most of your senses. In much the same way that most of the time your brain ignores the fact that it can fucking constantly see your nose. It's the same thing for all of your senses. And for literally everything you fucking think about, it's the same thing. Your brain's just making assumptions based on your past experiences. It's assumptions constantly. Assumptions and predictions before your brain has even received any true signals from the outside world. It's already made assumptions. That is cognitive bias. That's how your brain works. It's based on efficiency because there's no other way that it could work.
Review to inform her work. So I don't know.
And another thing that she mocked, and I think we're coming kind of to the end of the video here, but some of what she mocked, that maybe is not easily palatable, but is probably not that important anyway, is actually robustly true. So here's a meta-analysis on sex differences in humor production, right? So no evidence of publication bias. What do we see here? I mean, look at the forest plot. You see that the effects are consistently in one
or why is Mooncat not that fun?
direction, that men have a higher humor production ability.
Triggered much.
Than women do. That maybe that's why her video was not that funny at the end of the day. But why might that be? Why might we see this kind of a sex difference in humor production ability? What do you think?
Well, this is kind of an idea put forward by Jeffrey Miller, actually, who she had lots to say about. She might not like this, but he suggests that humor production is a very sexually selected trait, that women like it.
Of course, you see who the author is here. My favorite guy, the primal Polly.
And we'll often say that humor is a very important quality that they look for in a mate. So men are going to be very maniacally driven to develop humor production and try and produce it as much as they can. It's a kind of a sign of intelligence, and perhaps controversially, maybe we get into some area of sex differences in intelligence. That might be a different video. But yeah, it's a sexually selected trait in that direction. Men don't really care whether their mate is that funny. Therefore, women, the mind of one sex shapes the mind of the other.
That's so fucking sad. Like, as a guy, if you're not looking for a woman who can make you laugh, what a fucking sad life you're gonna lead. I'm sorry, what a sad fucking life to lead if you're not looking for a girl who's gonna make you laugh. Mate, you should be making each other laugh constantly. Otherwise, sad fucking life.
Women are not gonna need to be as funny in response.
Yeah, precisely. And again, it kind of goes back to what people often say when they... And people say this when I post results from studies or something. They'll say, you're doing all this research, why don't you just ask women? And so this humor production is not all research just based on self-reports or asking people. But if you do ask women, like, do you want someone who's funny or smart. They'll almost always say yes. They act like you're not asking women, but what do you think you're doing when you survey like 1,000 women? I mean, you're not just asking what you're asking all the women, and you're quantifying it and adding it up. So that's kind of what we have there. That is, I think, the last thing. I know there's some things in this video we didn't miss, particularly about behavioral genetics and all of that. Probably for another video, or maybe someone else can go into that. But some of that is outside of the wheelhouse of evolutionary psychology. A little bit also. It's related. It's not unrelated, but it's probably a whole other topic. I hope this kind of clarified some of the big errors and misconceptions about it, and maybe people can get a different perception.
And I would encourage you to watch kind of both videos side by side, because a cursory view of her video without actually the context, without flagging, oh, that's error, oh, that's a lie, you might actually be quite compelled by it. It's quite a emotionally compelling interview. And the reason that Alex and I decided to spend some time actually responding to this video is for two reasons from my point of view. Number one, I would usually ignore these type of things. Evolutionary psychology is miscategorized within the literature, never mind in kind of pop psychology kind of YouTubes. But this person has a very large channel, so I thought it would be useful for some of our viewers to get additional context. And secondly, there are some within the evolutionary sciences who are kind of championing this video. And that to me is as harmful a misrepresentation of our field as it would be for someone to champion Manosphere, right-wing kind of red pill pickup artist videos too. So we must challenge the misrepresentation of evolutionary psychology wherever we find it. And this is one kind of major exemplar of that.
Very good closing words there. And thank you for coming on with me and everything. I hope it's a good video for all of the people. And
now we're going to go grab a beer and jump in the bath.
Exactly. The great William Costello, guys. Talk to you soon.
All right, we got to the end. Way! Oh shit! Why can't I hear it anymore? What did I do? Why is it not playing anymore? Oh shit, man. Oh shit. Oh shit. What? Why is it not playing anymore? Why is there no output device?